to start anything late. I think I was a total of 1 minute late in getting started. But for me, that was too long because every minute that I have with all of you is an tonight. So I've got the lights on my tripod on, room dark. And let's see how this works. My face isn't as red, so that's a good sign. So there you go. Welcome, everybody. Glad you're here with me. Glad we can engage on this lovely Friday evening, right? We're not out partying because it is pandemic time. So I'm sitting here chatting with you all, and this is a party for me. Any moment that I spend with all of you is an absolute pleasure. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Be sure to hit the like button. Be sure to hit the subscribe button. Be sure to hit the notifications bell. Yeah, I've got a few things I want to talk about tonight. A few things. I think I am actually going to write a short book about BreadTube. I am going to write a short polemic against the BreadTube ideology because it needs to be said. You all listen to these lives, you probably know everything that will be in it. But it needs to be said, and I think that that more people will read it, and I think I will write a short booklet critiquing the BreadTube viewpoint. I've done some work on it already, and we shall see how it goes. Right, a lot of times I'll start a book project and not finish it, or I'll put it on hold. But I think I will put out a short piece about BreadTube. But yeah, so the way we do things here tonight, I'm going to give my opening remarks, kind of go over some of my critique of the BreadTube ideology and what Marxism actually is. And then from there, we'll do our roll call. And then from there, we will do the super chats, and I will answer your super chat questions. And, keep the super chats rolling in. I'll be on here answering your super chat questions as long as they keep rolling in. So there you go. There you go. All right. First super chat, Alabama union vote. Very good. Very important question. Spoke about that earlier today on Sputnik Radio where I was interviewed, but I will speak about it once again. Absolutely. Very good. And any other super chat questions, just keep them rolling in. I will write them down and answer them in the second half of the program. So now, folks, I don't know if everyone... Look, it's not a good way to put it. Folks, part of the reason I became a Marxist, socialist, communist is because I spent a lot of time around conservatives. And I heard the conservative viewpoint constantly. And I became a Marxist and developed politically. Feeling un-American. And I developed politically by learning to argue against the prevailing conservative viewpoint. That's what I did. I argued against what conservatives believe, and having argued against them, I developed my own views. That's how I grew and evolved politically. And I get the impression that a lot of the voices that are suddenly on the internet talking about socialism are people that have never met a conservative. I think they don't seem to understand what conservatives believe. They don't seem to comprehend conservative viewpoints. They don't even really seem to comprehend what average Americans believe about communism. And I for the lack of, because there seems to be a lack of familiarity with what I heard my whole life and what Americans hear their whole lives about communism, because so many internet Marxists seem to live in kind of a bubble, I'm just going to go over pretty quickly what average Americans believe about communism and specifically about communist economics. Your typical American will tell you that communism is a system where everyone is equal. Everyone gets paid the exact same wage no matter how hard they work. They take from the rich or those who have and give to those who do not have. That's what most Americans believe. Most Americans believe capitalism is a system in which people have lots of money and people can work hard and become rich, and if you work hard you can be successful, and that getting rid of capitalism is trying to make everyone equal. And of course it doesn't work, because there's no incentive for anyone to do any work, because their ability to get ahead and get rich, and it's been taken away. What else do average Americans believe about communism? Well, many Americans believe that communism is taxation. All right. Wrote it down. Many Americans believe that communism is taxation. Right? People say, oh, I work hard at my job. I go and I work in my factory, or I work in my plant, or I work in my hospital, or I work in my place, and then so much comes out of my paycheck. So much comes out of my paycheck. And that money that comes out of my paycheck, that's all communism, right? That's communism. My wealth is being redistributed. The phrase redistribution of wealth is very, very, very common. Yeah, people are saying that the image is very bad. So now, should I turn this light on? Is that better? Does that improve things? Blurry video, does it better with the light on in the background? Does that help? But yeah, right? But people say, oh, when the taxes come out of my paycheck, that's communism. That's communism. Um, yeah, that's communism. When the taxes come out of my paycheck, that is communism. Light made it worse. Okay, that's communism, they say. Right? Redistribution of wealth. Communism is the redistribution of wealth, we're constantly told. Communism is a movement of getting the poor people together, taking from the rich what they have and redistributing it. And in some cases, we're told they're redistributing it absolutely equally. Communists, we are told, oppose wealth. They oppose wealth. They are opposed to wealth. Capitalists love wealth. They love people having money and wealth and such. Meanwhile, communists are against wealth. They think money is bad. They think people having money is bad. That's what they believe. Right. All right. Kieran. And that is what generally conservatives believe about communism. They tend to believe that communism, everywhere it's ever been implemented, it completely failed and led to nothing but mass starvation and death. Never had a single economic success. It's against money. It's against wealth. It wants people to be poor. It wants people to be absolutely equal. That's what they believe. Anti-work. And people, the beliefs that people have that go along with this are very extreme. Some of the beliefs these people hold are ridiculously extreme. For example, growing up, I was told by my parents, I was told by the people I went to school with, I was told by people everyone knew in the 90s in my little town in Ohio, that there was this system called socialized medicine. And that's when, you have a national health care service, or you have universal single payer health care. And when you implement socialized medicine, I was told, everyone dies, and that there's waiting lists, to get surgery, and people die in the waiting rooms, and the whole healthcare system just falls apart, and everyone dies and is miserable from socialized medicine, I was told. You know, well, that's just not true. Every other country in the industrialized world, Britain, France, Germany, Italy, Sweden, South Africa, almost every other country in the Western world, and almost every other country in the world has some form of socialized medicine or national health care. Cuba, a very small island, has a national health care system. The idea that national health care results in everyone dying and just it destroys the healthcare system is not actually true. It's just simply not factually accurate. British people are doing fine with their national healthcare service, right? Canadians, they're there might be problems, but they're not dying in mass. Um, and this is just malarkey. This idea that people all die from national health care, but it's what people widely believe. This is the propaganda of capitalism, and it's told people that national health care will kill them. I remember when I was in college, I had, there was somebody I worked with, and I asked him what he thought of Michael Moore, the filmmaker, and he said, oh, he's always promoting that socialized medicine kind of thing. But I have not seen a single country where socialized medicine actually works. And I said, really? Have you ever heard of France, Germany, Britain, Canada, Belgium, Sweden, Norway. I just started naming countries, and he said he was just in shock, right? Because this is what people used to believe, and people still widely believe this: that if you adopt national health care, everyone will die. Clearly, that's not the case. Most of the world, most of the Western world, most of the industrialized world has national health care, but people won't all die. But this is the propaganda that's out there, right? We're told that communists want to take people's wealth and money away, that communists are against wealth and money. They want people to be poor. We're told communists want to redistribute wealth. They want to tax everyone so that everyone has the exact same income. And it's never had a single success anywhere. It's always failed. It's always been destroyed. I remember I even had a professor in college who actually, this was her argument about why communism was bad. She said that when she first started teaching as a professor, she made very, very little money, and it was it was just awful. She described how awful it was when she first started being a professor, but then she got tenure and things got better, and communism would make it so no one could ever get ahead like she had. That was her argument, right? That she said, oh, communism would take away people's ability to get ahead like I did. I used to start out as a professor. I made no money, and my kids, I barely had enough to feed my kids for school and all of that. And now I've worked hard and I've become a tenured professor. Communism would take that away from me. She told us this. This is an English professor. I mean, this was her argument. Strong. That was her argument, right? This is the kind of thing people think about communism, right? That it's never worked anywhere. And I hate to keep repeating myself, but I listened to the breadtube crowd, and I don't think they've ever met these kind of people. I don't think they've ever engaged with people that have the general mainstream viewpoint about communism. And if you actually learn and understand Marxism, right? You know, um, I don't know what that is. If you actually learn and I kind of, you mean the August block? I'll write about that August block. All right, that's the August block is what you mean. All right, but if you actually learn and understand Marxism, you'll know that this is all a complete misconception. Marxism does not advocate everyone gets paid the same, and in fact, Marxism is not about the redistribution of wealth. Let me repeat myself. Socialism and Marxism are not about the redistribution of wealth. They are not about the redistribution of wealth. The redistribution of wealth happens under every system. Under every system, there is redistribution of wealth, right? I pay taxes. We all pay taxes, right? The streets outside of this building were paid for by wealth that was redistributed from people like me to the government. The government then used it to build the roads. Is the United States communist? No. Right? Some countries redistribute wealth a lot. Other countries redistribute wealth very little. We redistribute to big corporations in the form of corporate subsidies. We redistribute to low-income people in the term of food stamps, which is kind of a subsidy for agribusiness. There is redistribution of wealth under every system. Every system. And folks, if you want a real clarification about what Marxist economics is, you should read The Critique of the Goethe Program by Karl Marx. The Critique of the Goethe Program. And what this was that in Germany, a group of socialists got together and wrote their manifesto. It was called the Goethe Program. Karl Marx read it and went and just oh, it was so wrong. It was wrong, basically. Um, Maupin. And so he wrote a critique of the Goethe program. And one of the things he critiques about the Goethe program is that the Goethe program, the critique of the Goethe program, right? One of the things he critiques about it is it calls for the redistribution of wealth. This is what Karl Marx says. The prevailing distribution of the means of consumption is only a consequence of the distribution of the conditions of production themselves. The latter distribution, however, is a feature of the mode of production itself. The capitalist mode of production, for example, rests on the fact that the material conditions of production are in the hands of non-workers in the form of capital and land, while the masses are only owners of the personal condition of production, of their labor power. If the elements of production are distributed, then the present day distribution of the means of consumption results automatically. If the material conditions of production are the cooperative property of the workers themselves, then there likewise results a distribution of the means of consumption different from the present one. Vulgar socialism, and from it, in turn a section of the democracy, has taken over from the bourgeois economists the consideration and treatment of distribution as independent of the mode of production, and hence the presentation of socialism as principally on distribution. After the real relation has long been made clear, why retrogress again? This manifesto called for the redistribution of wealth, and he said, no, we want to change the control of the means of production. It's not about redistributing wealth. It's not about taxing people's incomes and redistributing incomes. It's not about redistributing the wealth the workers create. It's about changing the economic system in which workers create wealth, right? Workers create wealth due to, in capitalism, they sell their labor power to the capitalist. The capitalist then, turns their labor power into products, makes profits from their labor. Socialism wants the means of production to be under public control and not operating according to profits, the means of production being controlled by society, right? It's not about redistributing income. It's about redistributing the ownership of the means of production. So when people say socialism is taxes, they are wrong. Taxes do not change the means of production, right? When people say socialism is everyone getting paid the same wage, they are wrong. Socialism is not about making everyone have equal wages. It's about public control of the means of production, right? Socialism is, Marx vehemently argues against the phrase redistribution of wealth. Marxism is not about the redistribution of wealth. He explicitly says it's not. But it gets better. Now, the one that I've hammered home, I've gotten endless flack from people. I've pointed out what is correct, that the phrase abolish billionaires is technically an anti-Marxist phrase. Marxists are not against wealth. They are against the system in which wealth is created. They are against exploitation. Marxists would say abolish capitalism. Marxists would say have the means of production collectively owned. But they would never say abolish billionaires, because the goal of Marxism is to create a society with so much wealth and so much abundance, libertarianism, that all inequality can break down. And this is also from the Critique of the Goethe Program by Karl Marx. He's talking about the different stages of socialism, right? And he says, but these defects, he's talking about the defects are inevitable in the first phase of communist society, as it has just emerged from the prolonged birth pangs of capitalist society, right? Right? He's saying that in a socialist society, you're going to have income inequality. In a socialist society, you're going to have some people have more than others. In a socialist society, you're going to have different wages and you're going to have that. He says these defects are inevitable in the first phase of communist society, as it is when it has just emerged after prolonged birth pangs from capitalist society. Right can never be higher than the economic structure of society and its cultural development conditioned thereby. And then he says, in the higher phase of communist society, after the enslavement of the enslaving subordination of the individual to the division of labor, and with it the antithesis between mental and physical labor has vanished. After labor has become not only a means of life, but life's prime want. After the productive forces have also increased with the all-around development of the individual, and all the springs of cooperative wealth flow more abundantly, only then can the narrow horizon of bourgeois right be crossed in its entirety, and society inscribe on its banners, from each according to his ability, to each according to his needs. I have dealt more at length with the undiminished proceeds of labor on the other hand, and with the equal right and fair distribution on the other, in order to show a serious crime it is to attempt, on the one hand, to force our party again as dogmas, ideas, which certain periods have... So anyway, if you read this paragraph is very important. Karl Marx is explaining what the higher stage of communism means. The higher stage of communism, the ultimate goal of communism, is a society in which the enslaving subordination of the individual to the division of labor, and with it the antithesis between mental and physical labor, has vanished. A society with no division of labor. No one's a doctor, no one's a ditch digger, no one is a lawyer, no one is an assembly line worker. There is no enslaving subordination to the division of labor, and there is no antithesis between mental and manual labor. Text by Communists on Socialism. All right. Right? So a society in which there's no division between mental and manual labor, a society in which labor has not only become a means of life, but life's prime want, meaning people only work because they feel like it. No one's compelled to work. People work because work becomes completely voluntary. It's not a means of life, but it's rather life's prime want. People work because they feel like it. After the productive forces have increased with the all-around development of the individual, meaning freedom, right? And all the springs of cooperative wealth flow more abundantly, meaning huge increase in wealth, huge increase in living standards, only then can the narrow horizon of bourgeois right be crossed in its entirety, and society inscribe on its banners, from each according to his ability, to each according to his needs. So the goal of communism is not to make it so no one has wealth, that everyone lives more frugally because we think that's more holy, or we think wealth is bad. It's to create so much wealth that the division between mental and manual labor breaks down, that people only have to work because they feel like doing it, and so much wealth that the need for a division of labor is eliminated. Right? I mean, this is about raising the level of productivity and the technology and wealth in society so high that all forms of inequality can ultimately break down. That is basically what Marx is arguing for. Reading habits and writing tools. Writing tools. That's what he's arguing for here. So Marxism does not oppose wealth, right? And you have to make that clear to people. People say, look, I mean, like that teacher I had who said, oh, I never could have gotten ahead. Never could have gotten ahead. Writing it down. I see that. Never could have gotten ahead. No. Communism is about making a society with so much material abundance that so much wealth, so much prosperity, that the very need for a division of labor breaks down. And I've made this point many, many times, but it's like, again, a lot of these bread tube people, they seem to think exactly what conservatives think communism is, but they think it's good. But it's worse than that, actually. So if you want to understand the actual Marxist understanding of economics, you have to read the Critique of the Goethe Program. It's not about redistribution of wealth, and it's certainly not against wealth at all. It's about public ownership of the means of production so that wealth can vastly increase. And this is really, really, really important to understand because this has been lost. The bread tube crowd, a lot of them don't get this. And when you're arguing with anti-communists, you have to make this abundantly clear, right? You have to make this abundantly clear. I didn't miss that super chat. I wrote it down. Welfare state of China. Wrote it down. Now, folks, I want to talk about some other things because part of the reason I am convinced that there is so much confusion is because when it really gets down to it, a lot of these folks just think economics is not important. Socialist struggles. Devastating effect. Hollywood. Or Mockingbird. Folks, a lot of them just think that economics is not important. They're really not interested in economics. A lot of Americans, when they hear economics, their mind just turns off, right? They think economics is not important. Economics is something I can't really understand. That's what a lot of Americans think about economics. And instead, they're kind of just waging a culture war. They're waging a culture war. They think that typical Americans, that conservative Americans, they're racist, they're sexist, they're transphobic, they're homophobic. They may very well be those things. And their identity as a socialist is about trying to cure average Americans of being racist, sexist, homophobic, or whatever, and trying to make average Americans more woke, right? That's basically what these folks think being a socialist is about. That is not what being a socialist is about. Socialism is about economics. It is about class struggle, all right? It's organizing the people of society to take control of the means of production and reorganize them to serve public good and not profits. That's what socialism is. All right. Socialism. Market socialism. All right. Now, it's important to understand that there are divisions within the U.S. ruling class, and there always have been. You go back to the founding fathers of the United States. Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson had very different economic theories. Very, very different economic theories. Alexander Hamilton argued that you needed to set up a government bank. That government bank should then build infrastructure like lighthouses and tax imports, tariffs, etc. Tax tariffs, and the United States should grow its domestic economy by building infrastructure, building lighthouses, and taxing foreign trade, and making the United States, a center of exports and imports, and the government, paying for the infrastructure to make that happen. That's Alexander Hamilton's economic model, and it was quite popular on Wall Street. It was quite popular among the New York City financial district. Thomas Jefferson had a very different economic model. Thomas Jefferson argued that America should be like a libertarian country, no government involvement, and that the ideal American should be the yeoman, right, which is the small farmer, and that this small farmer who works his own land, doesn't have any slaves, doesn't have any servants, just works his own land. That was the ideal American, and the yeoman is left alone and left to live his life on his own. The government doesn't tax him. The government just leaves him alone and lets him live his life. That was Thomas Jefferson's economic theories, right? The yeoman, it's like libertarianism, but it's populism of the small farmer. And Alexander Hamilton's economic theories, no, we do want to have a collective vision. We do want to tax. We want to use the money to make the country an import-export place where our industries are exporting things and we're importing things, and we want to build lighthouses. That's a different theory. That is a completely different, books by Lenin. That is a completely different economic theory. And, Wall Street, and the the finance capitalists of the time and the early American industrialists, they agreed with Alexander Hamilton. And the slave plantation owners and others tended to agree with Thomas Jefferson, right? Even though Thomas Jefferson, was, on paper, he was he did make anti-slavery statements. He owned a lot of slaves, and he eventually, he even raped one of his slaves and impregnated her. Um, but Thomas Jefferson did free all of his slaves when he died, and said anti-slavery things. His economic theories were promoted by the Southern plantation owners. Alexander Hamilton was very strongly opposed to slavery. Not only did he want to abolish slavery, but he actually wanted to have economic and U.S. relations with the Haitian slave revolutionaries. Alexander Hamilton's economic theories were very different than Thomas Jefferson's economic theories. They were very, very, very different theories, and there were different factions in the ruling class. To think that all the ruling class are all on the same team, they're all in it together, and they all have the same interests, is not understanding how capitalism works. If that was the case, if all the capitalists had the exact same interests, then capitalism would work much better. The reason that capitalism does not work as a system is because every capitalist is doing everything his own way, trying to advance his own interest, and is only concerned about profits. He's driving wages down. He's trying to maximize his own profits. He's competing with the other capitalists. They all have different interests that clash with each other, and you get a very irrational economic system. That is capitalism. Capitalism is highly, highly, highly inefficient because the economy functions according to the anarchy of production, the chaos of the market. That's the capitalist system. And that is how capitalism works. And there have always been divisions in the American ruling class. The American capitalists have always fought against each other over policy. And I'm going to quickly go over the big divisions. The big divisions that have existed among the American capitalist class. I talked about Hamilton versus Jefferson. I'm going to talk about the American Civil War. In the American Civil War, that was a big fight, and there were capitalists on both sides. The slave owners were capitalists, right? They made profits from the labor of the slaves. They sold the products that the slaves produced, the cotton that they picked, the different products, the tobacco the slaves picked. They made profits from it. They were exploiting the labor of the slaves to make profits. That was what the capitalists of the South were doing. The plantation owners were capitalists. I know Stefan Molyneux and a lot of libertarians think it's not capitalism if there's slaves involved. Well, they're wrong. They're absolutely wrong. Capitalism is a system of production for profit. And if you have a situation where the capitalist doesn't have to pay the people that do the work, that's better for the capitalist, right? Can you imagine how great it would be, how great the capitalists would feel if they never had to pay the employees? Well, that's what slavery is. That's what American slavery have to pay their employees. That's capitalism. So there was the plantation owners. They were one group of capitalists. And they were in bed with another group of capitalists called the British Empire, right? The British textile industry used cotton picked by American slaves. And that cotton was loaded onto ships and it was sent to Britain so the British could use that cotton in their textile mills. And as Britain was emerging to be a global imperialist and industrial power, it needed the cotton picked by American slaves. So the British capitalists were in there. Also, all the ships that went across the Atlantic carrying the cotton picked by slaves all had to be insured. They had to get insurance because a lot of times there was a storm, ships sank, so they all had to get insurance. Who sold them the insurance? Wall Street. Wall Street. So Wall Street, the Wall Street bankers that would insure the slave ships, that would lend the money to the plantation owners and lend money all over the world, the Wall Street bankers, they liked slavery, right? So the slave owners of the South, the Wall Street bankers, the British, they constituted one faction in American society that was ultimately on the side of the Confederacy during the Civil War. Well, there was another section of U.S. society, right? There were emerging industrial capitalists, manufacturers, right? That's what happened. There were emerging steel manufacturing in the United States. There was, an emerging textile industry here in the United States that emerged. There were all kinds of, meat packing facilities, and I mean, there was an emerging industrial capitalist class in the North, and they had a contrary interest to the interest of the slaveholders. The slaveholders wanted all the new states that came into the United States to be slave states. They wanted slavery to expand. The industrial capitalists did not want that. They didn't want that. Neither did the small farmers of the North, right? There were many, many groupings in U.S. society in the capitalist class that did not like the power of the plantation owners of the South and of Wall Street and their British allies. There was a division in the ruling class of the United States. And if you want to read one of the strongest economic critiques of slavery written by supporters of Abraham Lincoln who opposed slavery, you can read the writings of Henry Clay, right? Henry Clay and Henry Carey and others. They were strong opponents of slavery. And they argued that there were two economic systems in the world, the American system and the British system. And they argued that the British system was the system of free trade, was the system of slavery, and it was a system that held back industrialization. Whereas they argued the American system, which they said came from Alexander Hamilton, they said the American system was a system that didn't believe in free trade, but instead believed the government should work in a harmony of interests with industry, right? That government and industry and all of society, there should be a harmony of interests where the state is leading to further industrialization of society. That is what the supporters of Lincoln believed, and their opponents were the slaveholders and the British and Wall Street. Could Reconstruction have happened differently if Benjamin Franklin but Okay, I'm going to give you kind of a vague answer. I don't know all those names. All right. So there was a clash. There were two factions in the ruling class. And I must say, there is one of these Marxist groups that exists that refers to Trump supporters as the new Confederacy. They do this. On their website, they argue that there's this new Confederacy of Trump supporters. Well, if they've ever read Karl Marx, they would know that's wrong, right? The Confederacy was very much globalist in its orientation. It was tied in with the British. It was tied in with Wall Street. And it was Lincoln and Henry Carey and Henry Clay and the Northern industrialists who favored protectionism. If anything, Donald Trump's economic rhetoric is far closer to Abraham Lincoln's. And the Confederacy was globalist. It was about, global free trade and the British and Wall Street. And so calling the Trump supporters the new Confederacy is just the height of ignorance. This group does not understand economics, but they don't care about economics. Before I did this live, I actually confronted somebody who supports that analysis, and I said, how on earth can anybody who understands economics think that the Trump supporters are the new Confederacy when the Confederacy was for global free trade, and it was Abraham Lincoln and his allies that were favoring protection for American industries. Trump's protectionist demagogy is closer to Lincoln, and the Confederacy is all about free trade. So how does that work? And the person said to me, come on. They said to me basically, come on, don't be obtuse. And then they said the reason that they call them the new Confederacy, this Marxist group calls the Trump supporters the new Confederacy, is because they're racist. See, they don't care about economics. They're waging a culture war, right? Economically speaking, Trump is not the new Confederacy. Economically speaking, right, if you look at the economics of what both sides advocated, that's just not simply right. But they don't care about economics. They're waging a culture war. And this is what we're getting at. But if you want to talk about another division that existed in the U.S. ruling class, go up to the 1930s, right? In the 1930s, we had the Great Depression, the infamous Great Depression, where people were starving on the streets of the country. Very horrific. And, during the Great Depression, there were two different strategies about how to deal with the Great Depression. The first strategy was advocated by Henry Morgan and the National Association of Manufacturers and Henry Ford. And what they wanted was fascism. They wanted, a military dictatorship to crush the unions, to have lots of military spending to reboot the economy. And they tried to overthrow Roosevelt with the infamous business plot. And they admired Hitler and they admired Mussolini. And they wanted a fascist dictatorship in which the military would run the US government. They actually approached Smedley Butler, Marine Corps General Smedley Butler, they approached him about having a coup against Roosevelt. And it was the National Association of Manufacturers, and it was the factory owners, the industrial capitalists. What they wanted was fascism amid the economic crisis. Right? Best books on Marxist economics. That's what they wanted. But Roosevelt, obviously, was their opponent. And who was Roosevelt backed by? Well, Roosevelt's entire career, from the time he was governor of New York to the time he was president, Roosevelt was very close to a very powerful dynasty in U.S. society called the Rockefellers. Right? Standard Oil was started by John D. Rockefeller. John D. Rockefeller was the richest man in all of U.S. history. And he started, Standard Oil, which now today is called ExxonMobil. The descendant of it is ExxonMobil. And Roosevelt was very close to the Rockefellers. And the Rockefellers were not factory owners. The Rockefellers made their money through exporting oil on the international markets and through banking, right? And the Rockefellers, if you look at how they lived, right, they advocated having a more tightly controlled economy, right? They argued that it was necessary in order to hold off the class struggle to allow some unionization. And the Rockefellers were very close with the British, right? And the British were opposing the Nazis, right? The Nazis were the German imperialists fighting against the British imperialists. The Rockefellers were very close to the British imperialists. And the Rockefellers, because their money came from selling oil and their money came from banking, they did not have anything to directly lose from, labor unions. So, as a Bonapartist, right, one section of the ruling class in alliance with the working class, Roosevelt supported the labor movement in alliance with the Rockefellers as a way of holding back the threat of a fascist military coup by the National Association of Manufacturers and Henry Ford and Henry Morgan. There was a division. The industrial factory owner capitalists wanted fascism. The Rockefellers wanted social democracy. So Roosevelt, in an alliance with the Rockefellers and with the labor movement, he built the labor movement and he held off the threat of a fascist coup. That's what Roosevelt did. And yeah, that's what Roosevelt did. And so there was a division in the ruling class. And that's how it was dealt with. Right? These things are important to understand. Right? Communists maneuvered within that division. Communists supported Roosevelt against the factory owners, right? They built the labor movement. Roosevelt was more sympathetic to the USSR, saw the Nazis as the main threat. The factory owners saw the Soviet Union as the main threat, weren't so hostile to the Nazis. Favorite debates. That was a division. There you go. Now, after the Second World War, there was another division in the U.S. ruling class. Right? After the Second World War, you had McCarthyism, and you had the lower levels of capital, the smaller levels of capitalists kind of revolting against the big capitalists, against the Rockefellers. The Rockefellers were in the Republican Party, but when Barry Goldwater was nominated as the Republican candidate for president, you saw almost an uprising by the Rockefellers and by the wealthier interests in the Republican Party against Barry Goldwater. Barry Goldwater was considered to be a fanatical conservative who was in bed with the lower level capitalists. The John Birch Society was a group of conservatives who believed that drinking water was communist, that believed that the Rockefellers were communists, and the Rockefeller family, they were conservatives, but they were pushed out of the Republican Party essentially. Great book called Market Elections by Vincent Copeland talks about this. How the Rockefellers were in the Republican Party, but they were basically pushed out of the Republican Party by lower level capitalists, by the John Birch Society, by Barry Goldwater. That the Rockefellers, because they believed in birth control, they were big supporters of birth control, because they were socially quite liberal. They funded the work of Alfred Kinsey and the Kinsey Report, which was kind of a groundbreaking, report on sexuality in U.S. society. Because of that, the Rockefellers, because they were kind of socially liberal, and because they advocated a more liberal policy, the John Birch Society, all kinds of lower level capitalists, the military industrial complex, forced the Rockefellers out of the Republican Party. And there was a big fight. And the Rockefellers hated Richard Nixon. Right? When Richard Nixon came into office, the Rockefellers, were very opposed to him, and they worked with the media against Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon was seen as an ally of Howard Hughes, as an ally of military manufacturers, as an ally of J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI. But Nixon was very opposed by the Rockefellers and by the CIA and by the liberal wing of the American establishment. There are divisions. There's a very good book called The Yankee and Cowboy War by Carl Oglesby, where he talks about the assassination of John F. Kennedy, the Watergate scandal, the peace movement, the 1960s peace movement, as being a struggle within the ruling class in the Yankee and Cowboy War. And he talks about the Yankees being the Eastern establishment, the Rockefellers, the New England old money, and the Cowboys being the weapons manufacturers and the little Texas oil men, and that is the division, right? And that the 1960s and Howard Hughes, and that there was a big division in the ruling class between these factions. Now, right up to today, what's going on today? I maintain that this division in the U.S. ruling class continues. That Silicon Valley and Wall Street represent that old Eastern establishment. They represent a wing of the ultra rich, and that there are a number of lower level capitalists who aligned themselves with Donald Trump to revolt against that Eastern establishment. The Rockefellers, the Carnegies, the DuPonts, the old money that's tied in with the big four super major oil companies, BP, Chevron, Shell Oil, and ExxonMobil, right? That's Chase Bank, that's HSBC Bank, right? That's the Wall Street elites, the four super majors, the oil bankers, and Silicon Valley, the tech giants, the tech monopolies, right? That Google and Facebook and Microsoft and the tech giants and the oil bankers are fighting against Betsy DeVos, Mike Lindell, Bernie Marcus. Bernie Marcus, the owner of Home Depot, huge Trump supporter. Betsy DeVos, right? Her brother is Eric Prince of Blackwater. She's the heiress of the Amway fortune. And was a huge ally of Trump and was Trump's Secretary of Education. You can go down the line, right? The fracking companies, were aligned with Trump, and that there was a division among capitalists, where the lower level capitalists were for Trump, and the higher level capitalists wanted to remove him and did successfully remove him. Right? That's basically the fight in the U.S. ruling class right now. That the ultra rich, you can call them, slavery replaced economic slavery. That the ultra rich, Silicon Valley, the Rockefellers, the big oil companies, they have a long-term strategy. They're rich enough that they're not afraid of losing their position and losing their short-term profits. That's why under Barack Obama, you saw a strategic drop in the oil prices. In 2014, the oil prices dropped significantly. It hurt the fracking companies, it hurt Russia, it hurt Iran, it hurt Venezuela, but it's more secured the monopoly of the big four super major oil companies. Hurt the fracking companies, right? But they can do that. They're thinking strategically. They're thinking in the long term. We can drop the oil prices in order to have our position protected, right? The Facebook, social media, Microsoft, those elements, they're more managerial. They're thinking about how do we strategically in the long term work to maintain the dominance of the United States around the world. Meanwhile, the lower level capitalists, they just want to make profits. This is a division in the ruling class I've talked about. The managerial bourgeoisie that is into social engineering and is into strategically planning out how to dominate the world for American power and corporations, versus the entrepreneurial bourgeoisie that just wants to make money and has a more libertarian perspective, right? They want to deregulate everything, they just want to make money. And they resent the fact that the government very much is tied in with the big corporations. This is a division, in the U.S. ruling class. It's a big division. Now, what is basically going on is that there is a culture war happening in the United States. There's a culture war. And what's going on is that the managerial bourgeoisie, the ultra rich, they have decided that because Russia and China are competitors with the United States around the world, and because Russia and China are both very conservative countries, they're socially quite conservative, that the United States needs to appear as the woke, liberal, free alternative to Russia and China. They want the United States to have a woke makeover. Okay. Hitler meeting Palestinians. Ow. We refute left support. Writing it down. So, they basically want the United States to look like the free, liberal alternative to Russia and China around the world. Right? During the Cold War, the Soviet Union would humiliate the United States over Jim Crow segregation. When Emmett Till was lynched, they took the image of Emmett Till's mutilated body, and they sent it all over the world. The Soviet Union would humiliate the United States. It's you say you're a democracy, you say that you're a free society, look what you do to black people. And they would expose the United States for the horrors of Jim Crow segregation. And China was very friendly to Robert F. Williams, and Mao wrote statements in support of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. So, you saw that division. However, it was kind of social liberalism that was able to maneuver and bring down the Soviet Union, right? Many people have pointed out that the CIA was very good at marketing the image of the United States. People in the Eastern Bloc thought the United States was a land of freedom and Coca-Cola and Beatles albums and rock and roll and LSD and free love. And it was the counterculture liberalism that made the United States look very, very sexy to people who grew up in the Eastern Bloc. And it was the belief that the United States was this free, exciting, liberal society that was able to kind of, create the unrest that led to the overthrow of socialism in the Eastern Bloc. And Zbigniew Brzezinski was part of this. And so basically, having learned from the Cold War, you now have a huge effort to try and change the image of the United States. Barack Obama as president was a big deal. That showed we were getting over racism. It was supposed to say to the world we were getting over racism. His middle name was Hussein, and so that was to show to the world that, see, we don't really hate Muslims over here. We're friendly to the Muslim world. That allowed the United States to manipulate the Arab Spring events and push the Arab Spring in the direction that they wanted. Right? That is how Silicon Valley and the big oil companies want the world to see the United States. They want the United States to be viewed as a liberal, prosperous, open society, that we've gotten over racism, we've gotten over our ugly past, we're friendly, we're tolerant. That's how they want the U.S. to be seen. However, the lower level capitalists are not into that. They tend to draw a lot of support from evangelical Christians. They tend to not want to take measures to correct racial injustice, and the lower level capitalists have more of a conservative outlook, and they are rejecting what you can call the woke makeover of U.S. society, that the more powerful and more strategic imperialists are trying to impose. Um, that's what's happening, right? That there is at this point, I would say, an effort to impose kind of a woke makeover to make U.S. imperialism look better. And there's a lot of deeply conservative traditional Americans that are rejecting it. And why is there such a strong rejection of it, right? I mean, the civil rights movement happened and it was quite controversial at the time, but we got to the point that now we even have a national holiday for Martin Luther King Jr. So why is it that this woke makeover being pushed by the ultra rich, why is it that it is being rejected? Well, it's being rejected because the U.S. economy is crashing. Because a lot of these neighborhoods in places like Alabama and Kentucky and Ohio and Pennsylvania, a lot of those neighborhoods are ruined and have foreclosed homes and roads that are crumbling and they're falling apart. So a lot of Americans are clinging to their traditions and clinging to religion and clinging to patriotism as a way to kind of resist, and as something they can hold on to amid this breakdown of society. When Barack Obama was president, there was a tape that was leaked of Barack Obama making fun of people in the Midwestern states. And what did he say about them? He said they're clinging to their guns and religion. They're bitter and they're clinging to guns and religion. What he was referring to is that as life has gotten worse for working class people throughout the United States, those of them that are conservative have responded to deindustrialization and the elimination of good paying industrial jobs and the lack of economic opportunities by becoming more religious and more traditional on the one hand, and on the other hand, by becoming very afraid of the world and buying more firearms, clinging to guns and religion. That's what Barack Obama was referring to, right? And so that's the fight. There's a culture war going on, right? The woke makeover of the Rockefellers that they want to impose on society, of Silicon Valley, Bill Gates, Jeff Bezos, is being rejected. The lower level capitalists, and they're in an alliance with deeply conservative workers to reject the woke makeover. And the ultra rich capitalists, they're in alliance with the left, if you want to call it that, to kind of force this woke makeover so that imperialism works better, right? That imperialism works better when everyone thinks the United States is a woke, free society that would never hurt anybody. And Trump giving the middle finger to the Muslim world, and George W. Bush calling it a crusade attacking Muslims, hurts America's image. America needs to be the woke, free society that overthrows dictators and spreads freedom and free markets all over the world. This is the division that is taking place. All right, Lincoln Greenbacks. This is the division that is taking place. And basically, here's the thing. I argue that as leftists, as real leftists, as people who believe what this is about, right? What Marxist economics is actually about, we shouldn't be part of this culture war. That's what I argue. That it is not in our interest to try and remake the United States to make imperialism work better. We should not be waging a culture war against deeply conservative Americans to try and give the United States the woke makeover in order to make imperialism work better. That is not our job. Our job is rather to win Americans who are suffering economically, not to cling to religion and guns, but to see that the answer is socialism. That is our job. Americans who are economically suffering need to understand the problem is capitalism. And the answer is the means of production being controlled by society, the banks, factories, and industries being organized to serve public good and not profits. That is the role that we should play. We should be organizing Americans to see that it is in their economic interest to have an economy that serves the public good and not profits. That is our duty. That is what we should be doing. And we want to dismantle imperialism, right? We want Americans to see that it is in their economic interest to dismantle imperialism, tear apart the imperialist system, and build a whole new world, right? Libertarians attacking corporate welfare more than the left. But I must say that in some cases we're kind of doing the opposite. If you want to understand how Marxists approach situations, this is another pamphlet by Karl Marx that you should read. The 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte. It's very short, and it's a pamphlet that Karl Marx wrote about France. In France in 1851, there was a military coup. The Parliament of France was violently overthrown by the French military. Louis Bonaparte, the nephew of Napoleon Bonaparte, led the military to violently overthrow the government and establish a military dictatorship. And Louis Bonaparte was a leftist. He was not a Marxist, not a socialist, but it was a left-wing military coup in France in 1851 by Napoleon's nephew. And why was this coup carried out? Because France was in a crisis. There were strikes and protests going on. There was an economic crisis. And so the left, and I put that in quotes, right? The Social Democrats, in alliance with liberals, got with the military, and they overthrew the government of France. And Karl Marx wrote this pamphlet explaining what had happened in 1851, what the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte. Now, Brumaire, that's a month in the French Revolutionary calendar. The French Revolutionary calendar has its different months. The 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, that was the day that the coup happened, on the 18th of the French Revolutionary calendar month of Louis Bonaparte. The military overthrew the government, and Louis Bonaparte established himself as the military dictator. And Karl Marx wrote about how this happened, and how, when there's a capitalist crisis, the capitalists fight among each other, and they want to stabilize society. They want to end the crisis, right? And they want to use the government to end the crisis. And how was it that Louis Bonaparte was able to pull off his coup? How did he take power? Did he build a workers' movement of the working class? No. Louis Bonaparte did not build a workers' movement. He did not build a mass movement of working class, average French people who just wanted economic justice. No, 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 no. This is how Karl Marx, in the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, explains the association that was created by Louis Bonaparte in order to take power. This is Karl Marx. Under the pretext of founding a benevolent association, the slum proletariat of Paris was organized into secret sections, each led by Bonapartist agents, with a Bonapartist general at the head of it all. Along with the ruined ruse of questionable means of support and questionable antecedents, along with the foul and advantage-seeking dregs of the bourgeoisie, there were vagabonds, dismissed soldiers, discharged convicts, runaway galley slaves, sharpers, jugglers, lazzaroni, pickpockets, sleight-of-hand performers, gamblers, procurers, keepers of disorderly houses, porters, literati, organ grinders, rag pickers, scissors grinders, tinkers, beggars, in short, the whole undefined, dissolute, kicked-about mass that the Frenchmen style la bohème. With this kindred element, Bonaparte formed the stock of the Society of December 10th, a benevolent association, insofar as, like Bonaparte himself, all of its members felt the need of being benevolent to themselves at the expense of the toiling nation. So basically, in order to carry out his military coup, Bonaparte got together all these lumpen elements. All these elements that are not producing wealth of the country. They're not factory workers. They're not farmers. They're lumpen elements. They are elements that kind of exist on the edges of society. And they're formed as kind of an army in order to give Louis Bonaparte the movement in the streets to become the left-wing dictator. And some of these names I mentioned here, they're worth pointing out, right? We know what jugglers are, right? It's people on the street who juggle things and begged for money doing that. We know what dismissed soldiers are, ex-military people, right? But what are literati? Literati, right? That's intellectuals. Right? Intellectuals, people that had kind of little intellectual groupings and followings, right? Your urban intellectuals, right? Keepers of disorderly houses. What do you think that is? That's prostitution, right? That's pimps and prostitutes, right? Rag pickers, organ grinders, right? I mean, yeah. You think about this. He builds this army of lumpen elements that are used to give Louis Bonaparte the ability to set up this left wing dictatorship, right? Vagabonds, foul, along with the foul and adventurers seeking dregs of the bourgeoisie, right? It's like con men, right? I mean, it's this coalition, the Frenchman style La Boheme. That's bohemians, hippies. It's basically this army of hippies and criminals that Louis Bonaparte creates in order to force his will on French society, in order to kind of set up a kind of it was literally a Bonapartist regime to try and stabilize French society. He builds this army of hippies. And Karl Marx writes about this, about how this army of hippies, this army of criminals and La Boheme and literati and organ grinders, he builds this army of hippies, to be his heat in the street. The military overthrows the government. And what does Louis Bonaparte do? He builds some railroads. He spends money on building railroads. He builds some, hospitals that give free health care to low-income people. But he still doesn't solve the problem. And the problem is capitalism, right? And by 1871, French capitalism is so unstable. They have the Franco-Prussian War. And the Prussians win, and the French government collapses, and then you have the Paris Commune, and the workers of Paris rise up and establish the Paris Commune of 1871. Bonapartism doesn't work because it doesn't address the underlying problem. The problem is capitalism, a system where profits come before people, and capitalism naturally creates an unstable system. As the capitalist is trying to increase his own profits, and trying to, drive up his profits, he lowers the wages of the workers. He replaces jobs with technology. He makes jobs more replaceable. He's constantly trying to decrease the amount of cost he has to give to labor. Well, those labor costs, what the capitalist calls his labor costs, are also the consumers. That's where the products are purchased from. And as the capitalist becomes more and more efficient in how he produces, he drives wages down, and pretty soon the market is glutted with products that can't be sold. This is the natural problem of capitalism. The worker can never buy back what he produces. I've done this before, but I'll do it again. This is why capitalism doesn't work. Why? If you have a company, you own a factory, and you are producing goods, right? The cost, right? Let's say that the cost of the good that you're producing is, the total cost is $5. You're making pens, and the total cost of the pen is $5. Very expensive pen, $5 pen, right? Now, how does the money go into the pen? How is that? How does the cost? Where does the money go to? Well, let's say the materials to make the pen cost $1. The value that the worker puts into the pen is $3, and the shipping of the pen is $1 more, and the total cost of the pen is $5, right? Right. So we have A plus B plus C equals D, right? The cost of the materials for the pen, the labor value put into the pen, and the shipping of the pen all adds up to the final cost. Well, here's the problem. The capitalist, in order to make a profit, the capitalist, right? He's not going to make a profit if he pays the worker the full value of his labor, right? Because then the capitalist makes no profit. So instead of the worker getting paid the full value of his labor, right? The capitalist takes 2 and pays the worker 1. Right? So the worker is really only getting paid a fraction of the value of his labor. But at the end of the day, in this equation I just drew up here, B can never equal D. B can never equal D. The amount the worker gets paid can never be enough to purchase the product. Right? It's bad enough the worker is getting exploited. He's not getting paid the full value that he puts into the pen, right? He puts 3 into the pen, but he's only getting 1. The capitalist has got to take 2 as his profits. But on top of that, the value that the worker is paid for his labor can never purchase the full product, right? It doesn't work that way. There is no way that the worker can buy back the product he produces. But the capitalist is constantly exacerbating that problem, right? The capitalist is constantly trying to make that problem more intense by maximizing his own profits, making labor less and less, driving the worker out of the assembly line, reducing the role of the worker in production, driving workers' wages down, hiring fewer and fewer people, paying those who are hired less and less and less. I don't know what that means. And at the end of the day, you have a market that is glutted with products that can't be sold. And just having Louis Bonaparte getting elected and building a lot of railroads and building some hospitals for poor people doesn't solve the problem, right? And having Adolf Hitler get in and put half the workers in concentration camps and the other half in military uniforms and spending a lot of money on the military doesn't solve the problem. And Roosevelt getting into office and building lots of bridges and railroads, it's great, but it doesn't solve the problem. Bonapartism cannot fix the problem of capitalism. Bonapartism doesn't change property relations. As long as you have an economy organized to serve the profits of the rich, and you have the anarchy of production, you're going to have this built-in problem. And this problem of capitalism, of the worker not being able to buy back what he produces, of technology eliminating jobs, of abundance creating poverty, right? That problem becomes exacerbated when there's a leap in technology, right? When there's a huge leap in technology, it tends to create a bigger problem, right? World War I came after Henry Ford's great leaps and advances in production, right? World War II came after a lot of technological leaps, and that technology leads to making people poorer, right? I've used this example many times, but it must be said. The problem with capitalism is very well summed up in the infamous coal miner's riddle, right? There's a story. There's a father, and he's with his son. The father's a coal miner. And the son says to the father, "Father, why is it so cold in our house?" And the father says, "Because we can't afford any coal to heat the stove." And the son says, "Why can't we afford any coal to heat the stove?" And the father says, "Because I lost my job at the coal mine." The son says, "Father, why did you lose your job at the coal mine?" The father says, "Because there is too much coal." That is capitalism. That is the capitalist system summed up perfectly. Abundance creates poverty. The more efficient technology becomes, the better the capitalist is at producing goods. The more coal there is, the more you have children cold because the coal miner loses his job. Abundance creates poverty. Under capitalism, people are hungry because there's too much food. The more food that's produced, the more people go hungry. Under capitalism, the more efficiently you produce food, the fewer people get hired, and as a result, more people are hungry. Under capitalism, people are homeless because there's too many houses. In fact, the more houses you produce, the more efficiently you produce houses, the more people become homeless. This is the natural functioning of the capitalist system. When you have a system where production is organized to make profits for capitalists, you have the chaos of the market, the anarchy of production. Frederick Engels, he said, under capitalism, the means of production only function as preliminary transformation into capital. When the economy functions in order to make profits for a group of owners, you have all of these problems. And the only way to get rid of it is to have socialism, right? Is to have a society where the mode of production changes, where the banks and the factories and the major industries, the means of production, the means of creating wealth are rationally planned and centrally controlled. You need to eliminate the rule of profits and get rid of profits in command and have a centrally planned economy. You need the means of production, the centers of economic power, to be organized to serve public good and not simply operate for the benefit of a few. No, that doesn't just mean having worker cooperatives. Worker cooperatives still try to maximize their own profits. No, that doesn't just mean having a high income tax rate. It's not about redistributing incomes. It's about public ownership of the means of production, having the banks and the factories and the major centers of economic power organized to serve public goods and not profits. Right? And this is the Marxist understanding. And what passes for leftism these days, what the bread tube crowd really are, is that they are that lumpen army. They are that lumpen army of Louis Bonaparte, right? That the ultra rich, they want to stabilize U.S. society, they want to give it a woke makeover. So they're doing what Louis Bonaparte did. They're building a lumpen army to try and force their will to beat back Mike Lindell, to beat back Betsy DeVos, beat back the frackers, beat back Bernie Marcus. They're building this lumpen army, this lumpen army of people, and someone in the comments said it sounds like Antifa. Well, you're absolutely right. It does sound like Antifa. That's exactly what Antifa is, that there is a Bonapartist struggle in the U.S. ruling class right now. And one section of the ruling class is building up QAnon and, militias and lower levels, the lower level of capital are building up the right. And the ultra rich, right? Bill Gates, Jeff Bezos, the oil companies, the Rockefellers, they're building up their army and their forces to try and force their agenda. And that if you're really a Marxist, you don't want to do this. If you're really a Marxist, you want to get out of the movement and to the masses. You want to get to average Americans, average working people, and tell them your problems aren't caused by immigrants. They're not caused by trans people. They're not caused by Jews. They're not caused by Muslims. Your problems are caused by the capitalist system. And we want growth. We want your family to prosper. We want your life to get better. And we want your community to become more prosperous. We love our country. We love our community. And the only way things can get better is if we move towards socialism. This is Marxism, right? It's not about building a lumpen army. It's not about supporting one faction of the ruling class against the other. It's about building a mass movement of working people getting to the masses. That is the essence. That is the essence of Marxism. I'm glad you appreciated it, Gringo. Old Gringo, I'm glad you appreciated it, because this is what I'm trying to get people to understand. This is, these two books, right? The Critique of the Goethe Program, the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte. These are essential works of Marxism. How do Marxists understand things? Critique of the Goethe Program, Marx makes clear what socialism is and what it is not. It's not redistribution of wealth, certainly not opposed to wealth. In the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, Karl Marx explains factions in the ruling class and divisions. And, these are two essential Marxist books where Marx is explaining how capitalist societies function in a state of crisis. So I'm trying to revive Marxism. I'm trying to push back against the bread tube delusions. And it's Friday night. It's probably Saturday morning. It's long past Saturday morning here in New York. But hey, I'm on here and I've got a lot of super chats to answer. So, folks, why that concludes my opening remarks. I just wanted to give kind of a layout of a Marxist worldview. And on that note, let me call you out as I see you. Names and locations. Who's with us tonight? Names and locations. Who's with us? And then I'll start answering these super chats because there's a lot of them. Names and locations. Who's with us tonight? Names and locations. Who's with us? Names and locations. Names and locations. Names and locations. Brazil, Rhode Island, Calgary, Australia, Nassau County, Char Char Darling, Ram from I don't know where that is, from Connecticut, I think, Cleveland, Pirate Alex, Wisconsin, Montreal, Chaya, good friend of the show, Toronto, Nubium, Joey from Belize, West Palm Beach, Bay Ridge, Donahue, welcome, Bay. I'm in Bay Ridge also. United Corporations of America, New Jersey, Australia, Jenny Lynn out in Cincinnati, Missouri, USA, Montreal, Detroit, Michigan, Troy and Kansas City, Missouri, Tristan from Maryland, Ramiro from East LA, two good friends of the show, Tahoe, Brazil, Madonna from the Islamic Republic of Iran, welcome Madonna, Glasgow, Scotland, Croatia, Northern California, West Palm Beach, Bermuda, California, Southern California, Kinky, SoCal, so red. Jeremy in High Point, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, USA, great opener. I'm glad. Manchester, United Kingdom, KCMO, Kansas City, Missouri, Northern California, Dublin, Ireland, Charlotte. Oh, that's what CLT stands for. Charlotte, North Carolina. Grand Canyon, Arizona, Southern California, Nashville, Beijing. Very good. Branson, Missouri, Detroit, Grove City, Ohio. Wow, Grove City. There you go. California, Australia, Wisconsin, Squeaky Chair, Ireland, Alameda, California, Kieran from San Diego, Northern Michigan, Kolkata, India, Patrick from Los Angeles, Quebec City, Mongus, hey Caleb, um, Daniel in Seattle, Florida, Dublin, San Francisco, Albany, New York, Marty from Illinois, Richard from Tacoma, Tony from Tasmania, Calgary, Canada. Very, very good. Very, 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 very good. Anyone else? Names and locations. Names and locations. Names and locations. 510 California. Do cities have names, in California? Numbers? Is that how it works? I'm just kidding, but yeah, 510 California. Okay, anyone else? Names and locations. Names and locations. Great stream, says Harold Sullivan. Good. Well, hey, I'm just kind of, on here freestyling or whatever. That's okay. Tara Hoot. Very, very good. All right, I am going to start answering these super chat questions. Alabama union vote that failed. Well, look, I talked about that on Sputnik Radio today with Dr. Wilmer Leon and Garland Nixon, two good friends of mine that have a radio show on Sputnik Radio. But look, the Democratic Party is the main source, the main place where union dues go. I mean, not technically, they don't directly give money to the Democratic Party, but the main thing that labor unions in the United States spend their money on is giving money to the Democratic Party. I mean, supporting Democrats in elections. That is, I mean, it's just a fact. If you know anything about labor unions in the United States, AFL-CIO, Teamsters, Change to Win, SEIU, the main thing that their money goes to is getting Democrats elected. And when Democrats get elected, they don't do much for the organized labor movement. They tend to, they get into office. And look, Barack Obama, when he was campaigning for president, he said, if there's ever a threat, to the right of workers to unionize, I will walk on the picket line. And then in Wisconsin, when workers were occupying the Capitol, he forgot all about that. Forgot all about it. Furthermore, right, and this is worth pointing out, that there was something called the Employee Free Choice Act, right? Employee Free Choice Act, IWW, bunch of wimps. Oh boy. Employee Free Choice Act, which was a law that would, enable unions in, to have union elections in a more, free way and such, card check and said, Obama forgot all about that. Look, Bill Clinton, the even previous Democratic president, Bill Clinton promised he was a friend of organized labor. He got all the labor unions to donate to his campaign and all the labor unions to spend money voting for him and backing him. And when Bill Clinton got elected, there was a huge upsurge in support for the Teamsters. And Ron Kerry, who was the leader of the Teamsters Union, Ron Kerry was in an alliance with the communists in the Teamsters Union. In the Teamsters Union, there is a communist faction, and it's called TDU, Teamsters for a Democratic Union. And it's a grouping, and there's Trotskyists involved, and there's Maoists involved, and they're like a communist faction of the Teamsters Union. They've been around for years, right? And the Teamsters for a Democratic Union, they were able to make an alliance with Ron Kerry, who was the leader of the Teamsters Union. And Ron Kerry became the head of the Teamsters. And Ron Kerry, in the Teamsters Union, he went ahead and he unionized UPS. Instead of just spending their money electing Democrats, Ron Kerry unionized UPS, right? The UPS became unionized by the Teamsters. There was a huge upsurge of young activists going out and supporting, the Teamsters and unionizing UPS. It was a huge campaign, and it was victorious. UPS got unionized. And after that, did Bill Clinton say, "Oh, that's great. I support labor unions"? Oh, that's not Bill Clinton, is it? Did Bill Clinton say, "Oh, that's great. I support labor unions. Good for you. Good for you, Ron Kerry. Thank you for unionizing UPS. That's democratic. The workers voted for it. I believe in it. I'm Bill Clinton." Is that what he said? No. No, it's not what he said. That is not what Bill Clinton said. Bill Clinton sent the Department of Justice to go after Ron Kerry. And Ron Kerry was investigated and driven out of the Teamsters Union. And later they've come out and information has come out and they've said that the charges against Ron Kerry, the leader of the Teamsters Union, were bullshit. He wasn't guilty. He wasn't committing crimes. But Bill Clinton was so much a friend of organized labor. That's why he sent the Department of Justice out to go get Ron Kerry. I mean, it was just unbelievable, right? I mean, and we've seen this, right? The Democrats are not friends of organized labor by any means, right? I mean, the Clinton machine, they pushed Ron Kerry because he unionized UPS. They pushed him out of the leadership of the Teamsters Union. Barack Obama turned his back on the workers of Wisconsin. Imagine if Barack Obama, the president of the United States, had gone to Wisconsin when the public workers of Wisconsin were occupying the state capitol for their right to unionize. Imagine if Obama had gotten on a plane and spoken to them, and just gone there for a photo op as the president of the United States and said, "I support the right of public employees in Wisconsin to be in unions." Imagine if that had happened. If that had happened, they would have won. That's not what happened. Barack Obama, he heard nothing about it. Imagine that Barack Obama had pushed very hard for the Employee Free Choice Act, but he didn't. This is the reality, right? The Democrats are not friends of organized labor. It's like an abusive relationship. I don't know if you've ever known anyone who was in an abusive relationship before. One thing that happens in an abusive relationship, always happens, is that the person who's being abused often says, "I know he's going to change this time." Right? Sure, he beat me up, but he's really sorry. He really means it this time, right? And then the person abuses them again, and they say, "Oh, okay, well, he's gonna change this time," and he doesn't. "Oh, he's gonna change this time." That's what the Democrats do to the unions. They beat up the unions. And then the unions go, "Oh, he's going to change this time." And then the Democrats beat up the unions again. And they go, "Oh, he's going to change this." And it just keeps happening over and over and over and over again. Look, imagine, right? Imagine if Joe Biden were to actually have said Amazon needs to be unionized. Imagine that. If the president of the United States had done that. But he wouldn't do that. He wants Jeff Bezos' money. I mean, look, Jeff Bezos and Bill Gates and the ultra rich wanted to drive out Trump, and so did the labor unions. And so they entered this alliance with each other. And at the end of the day, it seems like organized labor has lost. I mean, organized labor lost. This was a big loss for organized labor. And they had bots and trolls and all kinds of fake accounts all over social media pushing anti-union propaganda on behalf of Jeff Bezos. But look, I mean, I'm very disappointed to see that. I would love to see the workers at Amazon unionized. And the other thing is these small business owners should stop being libertarians, because think about it, right? If you're a small business owner, right? Who's buying your products? Who's buying your services? Workers. So if workers at a huge employer like Amazon, I think it's one of the biggest employers in the country, if they're getting union wages and they have union job security, they're going to start spending their money more in your community. Like, the small business owners should be huge supporters of the union effort. It's like Lucy and Charlie Brown with the football, says old Gringo. Exactly, exactly. The Democrats have done this over and over and over again. But there you go. And yeah, look, but look, I mean, you go back to the history of the communist movement, communists and their struggle with the labor bureaucracy. That's been a whole issue for communists. Communists and the labor bureaucrats are not best pals. Sometimes they work together, sometimes they don't. But William Z. Foster, Gus Hall, their whole history was kind of pushing back against the labor bosses, not being overly crazy and sectarian, but also not, not aligning, never aligning with the bosses against them. But, the labor bureaucracy is something we have to deal with. And, the labor unions, they talk a much more radical game than they used to. And they endorsed Bernie Sanders, not just regular Democrats. And, They talk a more radical game. They sound, for years, it used to be that the labor unions sounded almost right wing and conservative, but now you listen to a lot of these labor union bosses, they sound like socialists. A lot of them are DSA members. You know that? A lot of the people that are in charge of the AFL CIO are DSA members, members of the Democratic Socialists of America, right? A lot of them, a whole lot of them, a whole lot of them. I mean, in the 1990s, the head of the AFL-CIO was John Sweeney, and he was a DSA member. And I think Trumpka is DSA, if I'm not mistaken. Look, they're all in the DSA practically. I mean, all the labor bosses are DSA people these days, it seems. But they're not leading a militant struggle. They don't want to take the risks, right? They got a good gig under capitalism, right? They got their union bosses. They're making six figures. They get to ride around in limousines and have meetings with members of Congress and the president and stuff like that. And this is their gig, and they don't want to shake it up, right? If they did what Gus Hall and William Z. Foster did at the Flint sit-down strike, or the steel workers strike, they would be risking going to prison. And they'd be risking, and this is their gig. They've got a good gig under capitalism, running this huge union, getting lots of money. That's their gig, right? And sure, they'll push for more policies. But they don't want to take any risks, right? They don't want to take any risks. That is the problem with the labor bureaucracy, is that they have built a machine under capitalism. Okay, they've built this machine under capitalism. The labor unions, that's what they are. They are a machine. They protect workers. Workers get better wages. Workers really benefit from their machine. But they have built a machine that functions within the capitalist system. And ultimately, if you do that, if you build a machine that simply functions within the capitalist system, you're not going to have the militant class struggle outlook that is necessary to win big victories for the workers, right? The big victories for the workers' movement were won. They were won when the labor unions were run by communists, when the labor unions were run by revolutionaries and anarcho-syndicalists and socialists. That's the reality. The labor movement is strong when it's led by people who don't want to just set up under the capitalist system. It's led by people when it's led by revolutionaries, right? That's when it's strong. And when it's run by, corrupt, union bosses, it's not effective. And that's the struggle within the labor movement. And it's gone on. It's been like that for a long time. Look, I've known a lot of young communists who go work for the labor bureaucracy, and they get so angry and quit after a year, right? And I got to tell you, right, the labor union bosses have got it down to a science, right? Idealistic young person becomes a communist in college, and they think, I'm going to go work for the labor unions. And so they go into the labor union, and they have all kinds of training, to be a labor union bureaucrat, and all these kind of exercises and team building activities, and they work their butts off, and the labor bureaucrats don't pay them anything. Meanwhile, the labor bureaucrats themselves are making hundreds of thousands of dollars, and they get these 20-year-old communists, and they work their butts off for the union as union staffers or whatever, and they work so hard, and they realize at the end of the day that the labor bosses are too afraid to take any risks, and that's the problem, right? And they can work really hard for the labor unions, and they can believe in communism and work very hard, but it doesn't matter because the labor bureaucrats, the labor bosses, their heart isn't in it. Their heart just isn't in it. And that's the problem. And the reason that their heart is not in it, the reason that the head of the AFL-CIO's leaders and the Teamsters leaders, the reason that they're weak is ideological. They believe in capitalism. They don't believe in socialism. They might believe in social democracy and everyone gets free health care from Bernie Sanders or something. But they really, at the end of the day, they don't recognize the need for the banks, factories, and industries to be organized to serve public good and not profits. They don't believe that, right? That's why every union contract, you'll notice, every union contract that workers are forced to sign begins with a statement that labor and capital are both necessary, right? You read any union contract, the UAW contract, the steelworkers contract, the first thing the bosses want them to sign is labor and capital are both necessary. Well, at the end of the day, though, right? Labor and capital are not both necessary. If the banks, factories, and industries were organized to serve public good and not profits, if the means of production were controlled by society at large and you didn't have individual owners just trying to drive the workers to make as much profits as they could, things would still work. And the Soviet Union defeated Hitler without capitalism. The Soviet Union invented space travel without capitalism. You don't need capitalism. They always tell us the rich are job creators. You ever heard this? Oh, they're job creators. Well, go to the socialist countries of the world. Go to the socialist countries of the world. People have plenty of jobs. Go to Cuba, Soviet Union, people had jobs. We don't, the rich are not job creators, right? And organized labor in the United States really does buy into the idea that capitalism is necessary, and that is their weakness. In order to really win victories for the workers, you must have a Marxist outlook. And that's why the stuff we talk about on these lives is so important. And that's the weakness that we've seen when it comes to the union struggle and Amazon. So there you go. All right. The person says they are feeling un-American as a communist ethnic minority. Well, look, many African Americans, many Latinos, some Asian Americans, indigenous people feel that they are not. They are a separate nation. They feel like they're a colonized people within U.S. borders, and they reject the identity of being American. And I respect your right to absolutely do that. I would never try to demand that a black person or a Latino person or a Chicano person or an indigenous person or as an Asian person who felt in their soul they were not an American. I would never demand that you wave an American flag. You have the right to not feel American. You have the right, to self-determination. I mean, again, if the majority of the black community wanted an independent black republic, I would support their right to do it. I would never, try to demand that. So, I respect that. And self-determination. Look, a new socialist America, if indigenous people wanted a separate territory, we would grant it to them and we would give them reparations. Right? If black people wanted to have an independent black belt in the South and they wanted that, not that we were forcing it on it, but if the black community itself wanted an independent black republic, we would obviously have to give it to them and give them reparations. Look, if Aztlan, the Sun Belt, right? If Southern California and Arizona and New Mexico and Texas wanted to break away and form a separate Chicano republic, we would support the right to do that. Colonized people have the right to choose integration or separation for themselves. If black people want to be part of the United States, they have the right to do it. But if they don't, they also have the right to separation. And that's an important thing about being a Marxist is that you recognize that groupings and populations have the right to determine their own destiny. So there you go. All right. Okay, the Tudeh party in Iran. Why was it cracked down on? It was cracked down on because after the Islamic Revolution of Iran, there were, the government, the government of the Shah was toppled, and there were many different factions. Right? You have to remember. So the Tudeh party was only one. There were three major communist groupings in Iran after the Islamic Revolution. The first was the Tudeh party, which was the Communist Party. It was like the Soviet-aligned Communist Party. Then you had the Fedayeen, the People's Fedayeen guerrillas, and that was Maoists that were trying to wage a people's war in the countryside, the Fedayeen. And then you had the Mujahideen, and that was an Islamo-Marxist death cult. It's a terrorist death cult, Mujahideen cult, terrorists, murderers, right? And they believed that their leader, Masoud Rajavi, they believed he was a prophet set to bring some kind of global Islamic communist revolution to the world. Those were the three groups, right? And there were a number of clerics, in the early years of the Islamic Revolution that were very sympathetic to the Mujahideen Khalq and to the Tudeh party. But Ayatollah Khomeini, Imam Khomeini, the leader of the Islamic Revolution, he fired some of the more pro-Soviet clergy people. He fired them. He said he kicked them out of the government. Said we don't want pro-Soviet people in the government. So in response to that, the Mujahideen Khalq, the Islamo-Marxist terrorist cult, they bombed the Iranian parliament. They bombed the parliament building and killed 81 people, 81 members of the parliament. Now, you think it's bad. We're here in the United States. We're angry. We're upset about what happened on January 6th, where some people went into the Capitol building and vandalized property. In Iran, there was a bombing and 81 members of parliament got killed, right? And in response to that, there was a huge crackdown on leftist groups. Look, the supreme leader of Iran, Khamenei, he cannot move one of his arms, and that's because the Mujahideen Khalq, the ultra left, terrorist, thugs, MEK, they bombed at one of his press conferences. He was giving a press conference, and they blew it up. They had a bomb disguised as a tape recorder, and they blew it up, right? And that the ultra left adventurism, and I don't know if that's the right word, but the terrorist cult, Mujahideen Khalq, MEK, went on a killing spree in the aftermath of the Islamic Revolution and killed many, many people. And in response to that, there was a crackdown on Marxist groups because Marxist groups were considered a threat to national security. Also, you have to remember that Iraq invaded Iran, right? The Ba'athist government of Iraq invaded the Islamic Republic of Iran. And the Ba'athist government of Iraq got all of its weapons from the Soviet Union. It purchased weapons from the Soviet Union and was using those weapons to kill Iranians. And based on that, there was a feeling in Iran that the Soviet Union was their enemy because Soviet aligned Iraq was invading them. And because the Tudeh party was a Soviet aligned party, it was removed. Ultimately, in Iran, right, every legal political party must recognize the Iranian Constitution. Okay, the Iranian Constitution, I've read it. The preamble is Islamic. It says we are an Islamic republic. It's the Islamic Republic of Iran. Well, the Tudeh party and the Mujahideen, well, the Tudeh party and the Fedayeen both reject the need for an Islamic state. They reject the Islamic Constitution, so they are not legal political parties in Iran. Iran is an Islamic republic, and so only Islamic political parties can participate in the government. And that's how it works. I know that Marxism has a huge amount of influence in Iran, right? Even though there is not a legal communist party, there is a huge amount of Marxist thought in Iran. There are a lot of college professors who have studied Marxism. On Iranian television, they often give a Marxist kind of analysis of imperialism, though they frame it in religious terms, but they understand imperialism the same way Marxists do. Look, Che Guevara is very widely admired in Iran. Hugo Chavez is very widely admired in Iran. Maduro is very widely admired in Iran. Malcolm X is very widely admired in Iran. So yes, there is no legal Marxist political party in Iran. The Tudeh party was outlawed, and there was in 1988 there was a very big political crackdown, and there was a lot of executions of people who'd been involved with various Marxist groups. I mean, that's very sad. And look, this gets back to my main point, which is violent revolutions are not good things. Okay? Right? When violent revolutions happen, lots of people die. Right? And it's just a fact. Look, the Russian Revolution, the immediate seizure of power was somewhat peaceful. I mean, there wasn't a lot of killing. But afterwards, when the White Army came in, the Russian Civil War was horrendous. And during the Russian Civil War, the Bolsheviks implemented the death penalty for drinking alcohol because too many people were drinking and not fighting. And because the soldiers were drinking alcohol, the Bolsheviks, in order to defeat the counter-revolution, to defeat the White Army, they had to implement the death penalty for drinking alcohol. I don't drink alcohol, but I cannot ever in my mind imagine a situation where I would point a gun at someone and kill them because they drank alcohol. It is beyond anything I can imagine. But the Bolsheviks didn't implement that policy because they were mean. They implemented that policy because they were fighting for their lives. They were invaded by 15 countries. They were fighting the White Army, and people were being killed day and night, and it was a horrendous civil war. And in horrendous civil wars, you implement very, very harsh military discipline. And that's what happened, right? And that's what violent revolutions are like that. MEK. We'll talk about MEK. Violent revolutions are like that. And, after Fidel Castro took power in a violent revolution, a lot of executions. And in the Islamic Republic of Iran, after the Islamic Revolution, lots of executions, right? And we don't, violent. And one thing that always happens, it happened in the French Revolution, it happened in the Russian Revolution, happened even a little bit in the Chinese Revolution, is when there's a revolution, when there's a revolutionary upsurge, people don't just agree on when it ends. Okay? It's a revolution, right? People are rising up. So it's like when people have a revolution, it's not like they all agree, oh, on this date the revolution ends and we accept the new order. That's not how it works. That is not how it works, right? And in the Bolshevik Revolution, the Bolsheviks became the new ruling party. Well, there were a lot of anarchists, left socialist revolutionaries and the Kronstadt sailors who said, well, we're going to keep going until we come to power. Well, the Bolsheviks had to say, no, you don't. We're the new ruling party. And there were a lot of anarchists and other Marxist groups that got executed in the Bolshevik Revolution. And this tends to, in the French Revolution, there was a similar situation, right? Where there was the Thermidor and there was executions. China-Tibet conflict, there was executions, right? And again, when you have an armed conflict and there are groups killing each other, you can't respond. It's one thing in a civil, peaceful situation where people express their views and you express, but when you're in an armed conflict, when people are blowing each other up and shooting people and killing them, you cannot respond. You meet force with force, right? And that's the aftermath, the Thermidor. They refer to it as the Thermidor, right? The aftermath of a revolution. The Thermidor is very ugly, usually, because revolutionaries must kill other revolutionaries, right? In order to stabilize the new order must crack down on other revolutionary forces. Yes, the new force came to power in a revolution, but you know, it must crack down on forces that want to remove them, right? Revolutionary chaos, revolutionary violence. It's not a productive thing. So this is why this is why it is necessary to be clear that we do not, in the United States, advocate a violent revolution. We want a peaceful transition to socialism. We would prefer that the capitalists of the United States recognize democracy, and if the people of the United States are ready to embrace socialism, that they would allow the democratic process to take place and transition to socialism. And if we go to the American people and tell them that we want a violent revolution, they will reject us because nobody in their right mind wants a violent revolution. I don't want a violent revolution. And if you really know what a violent revolution is, you wouldn't want a violent revolution, right? And that violent revolutions are horrendous, horrendous events, right? So we are for a peaceful transition to socialism, but we are aware of the fact that the capitalists generally are very violent and that generally they do try to suppress people's democratic rights. And I mean, they look what they did in Chile to Salvador Allende, and look, we should be recognizing that the capitalists are likely to be violent and are likely to do what they did. And Abraham Lincoln wanted to roll back some of the power of the slaveholders. The slaveholders were violent and tried to engaged in violence, right? And so we shouldn't expect that the capitalists of the United States won't be violent in their attempt to hold back democracy, but we do not advocate violence. We advocate a peaceful transition to socialism through the democratic process, through electing people, through changing the Constitution, through writing a new Constitution. We want a peaceful democratic transition to socialism. That's what we want. Okay. Roger Kieran says market reforms hurt the USSR. Exactly. Now, Roger Kieran also makes the point that something needed to change in the USSR in the 1980s. But he points out that the change they got ended up destroying the Soviet Union, right? There needed to be some kind of change. And I've often said that the Soviet Union could not bend, so it broke. That's generally the way I explain it, right? We'll talk about the AOC thing. All right. AOC police thing. All right. Yeah, we'll talk about that. That some kind of reform was necessary, right? Some kind of reform was necessary. And unfortunately, the reform that they got made things worse and ultimately destroyed the Soviet Union. And that's the point that needs to be made. Look, there is a school of thought which I once adhered to that argues that the way things were in the Stalin years in the Soviet Union, the 5-year plans, that was like the most pure form of socialism. It was the most pure form of socialism, and if only the Soviet Union had stuck to that pure Stalin model, everything would be okay. Well, that's not true. That's not correct, right? That Khrushchev was very much a product of a lot of what happened during the Stalin years. And, Gorbachev was very much a product of what happened during the Khrushchev and Brezhnev years, okay? And there is no magical pure formula for socialism, right? Again, that's like what the Trotskyites do. The Trotskyites, they say, oh, Trotsky had the one true. No, there is no one true. Socialism as a system is constantly adapting and changing. In China, they were able to adapt their socialism in a way that worked, right? In Russia, they tried to adopt their socialism and it ended up collapsing. All righty. All righty. The anti work left trend. Well, look, right? Getting to a society where people don't have to work, where people's work is voluntary, it would be a good thing. Advancing technology, creating a vast state of abundance, that's ultimately a good thing, right? So some parts of this anti-work trend I can agree with. I can understand. Look, I many years I was miserable. I like the job I have now as a journalist and such, but many years, when I would go to work at the call center or work at the gas station or I mean, I had a job cleaning dorm rooms when I was in college. Like I would clean the dorm rooms, and it was absolutely miserable. I was bad at it too. I don't. My attention to detail sometimes is not good, and I was really bad at that. And or I worked in a sub shop, and I mean, it's miserable, right? And for people to want to get to a society where people don't do that, that is one of the goals of communism, right? Is to get to a society where work becomes life's prime want, where people only work because they have to work, right? Or because they want to work, where there's not a compulsion to labor, right? But overall, though, I do think that you know there's a difference between wanting people to have lives that are fulfilling, right? And you know, and wanting people to not work in an experience they feel degraded by or feel miserable by, but also holding on to the vision of building a more prosperous world, right? And holding on to aspirations, not getting bogged down in hopelessness and such. Um, yeah, so there you go. Yeah. Yeah, good work, mods. Yeah, I don't know what's happening tonight. I must have really made the phony leftists really angry, but that's okay. You're doing a great job cleaning up the trash in there. All right. Strong leftist populists. Do we need a strong leftist populist leader? Well, I think that left wing populism, is a good thing, and that when people look to leadership, they look for strength. So there you go. All right. So the person asked about the August faction, and I think they were asking about the August Bloc. So the August Bloc, when Lenin formed the Bolshevik Party, so Lenin was in exile in London, 1903. He called the famous meeting and pitched his idea for the party of a new type, the party of new type. Right? He was going to form a central committee for the Bolsheviks that would be a party of the new type, party of new type. Right? So he pitched that idea, and the majority of the people in the room supported it. And they became the Bolsheviks, the majority. And the minority in the room rejected it, and they were called the Mensheviks. Trotsky, Trotsky didn't join the Bolsheviks, but wasn't a Menshevik either. And he had this idea that he was going to form this thing called the August Bloc, where he would unify the more revolutionary elements among the Mensheviks with the Bolsheviks. That was his idea. He wasn't going to become a Bolshevik, but he was not going to be reformist like the Mensheviks. He was going to start this faction among the Mensheviks that was more revolutionary. It was going to be called the August Bloc. And it failed. Barely anyone showed up. No one was interested, right? You were either with Lenin or you were with the Mensheviks. No one was interested in joining Trotsky's like halfway August Bloc. It failed. And Lenin was very angry at Trotsky for doing that. Very angry at Trotsky for forming an August Bloc, right? And not, becoming a Bolshevik. But this fits in with a whole pattern in Trotsky's career, right? Trotsky never really embraced Bolshevism, right? Bolshevism said that the revolutionary energy would come from the East and the developing world. Trotsky held on to his belief that New York City was the foundry where the fate of mankind would be forged. Trotsky felt that the revolutionary energy was in the West. And after the Bolsheviks had their revolution, um, you know, after they had their revolution, Trotsky basically felt it was hopeless unless they spread to the Western countries. And after the Trotskyites were kicked out of the Communist International, what did they do? They joined the socialist parties of the world, and they had what was called the French Turn. And they joined the socialist parties and formed militant minorities. They basically did the August Bloc once again. And if you talk to Trotskyites nowadays, Trotskyites will tell you they're socialists. They won't tell you they're communists, right? They're socialists, and they will repeat the anti-communist propaganda against Cuba or against Venezuela or against China. They'll always repeat it. Why? Because they are part of the West. Trotskyism, Marxism, Lenin broke Marxism with the West, right? Marx was a Western person. He was born in Germany. He lived a lot of his life in France and in Paris and a lot of his life in London. Marx was inspired by the French Revolution. He was a Westerner, right? And he was very Eurocentric. His worldview is he thought, Western Europe was the most advanced. Socialism would happen there first. Lenin broke with that aspect of Marxism. Lenin de-Westernized Marxism. Lenin developed his party of a new type, which people said was a lot more like a monastic or religious order than a revolutionary organization. And he developed his theory of imperialism. Lenin supported nationalism among colonized people fighting for their independence. Lenin largely de-Westernized Marxism. And if you look at the history of Marxism, Marxism, from the time of 1848, when the Communist Manifesto was published, up until today, Marxism has gotten less and less Western. It has become more and more Eastern, right? And, Xi Jinping and 21st century socialism, all of these things are attempted coup to get Kim Il Sung out of power. I don't know anything about that. All of these things are very much, Marxism becoming less and less a Western ideology and more an ideology of the developing world and of Eurasia. And so, Trotskyism was this halfway, okay? Right? It was, the social democracy and reformism and social imperialism became to dominate leftism in the West. Bolshevism became the Eastern alternative, the revolutionary energy from the East. Trotskyism was this halfway, right? Trotsky didn't want to be as reformist as the Social Democrats. He wanted to keep the revolutionary energy, but he never was able to jump over into the Eastern camp. He never really fully became a Bolshevik. I guess in July of 1917, he joined the Bolsheviks. But if you look at his history, he was never really comfortable with Bolshevism because he wasn't able to make that leap. He hated peasantry, and he thought the West was the best. He thought the West was the most important. And right after the Russian Revolution, another incident, right, that it's important to understand is that the Bolsheviks, they took power that they would end World War I, that peace, land, and bread. So the Bolsheviks came to power, and Lenin said, okay, we need to end the war. We came to power on the promise that we would end World War I. We need to do it. And so they sent Trotsky to go negotiate the treaty with the Germans to end the war. And Trotsky wouldn't sign the treaty. Trotsky refused to sign the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, right? Brest-Litovsk, a very famous treaty that's ended Russia's involvement, where Russia and Trotsky refused to sign the treaty. He went back to Moscow without signing the treaty, and he said, "Oh, I've got a new position. We'll have no war, but no peace, and we'll just use the Russian Revolution to launch a new war. It won't be World War I. It'll be a new war to spread communism all over Europe." And Lenin and Stalin and all the leaders of the Bolsheviks said, "Are you out of your mind? We took power in this revolution saying that we're going to end the war. So end the war. Sign the treaty." It was crazy that Trotsky was sent all the way to Germany to negotiate the end of the war and wouldn't do it, and he wouldn't sign the treaty because he was so committed to West is the best. We got to have this violent revolution that spreads to the Western world. And his theory of permanent revolution, which was a horrendous theory, right? It says the peasantry cannot be revolutionary, never enter an alliance with the peasantry. The only point of having socialism in the East is to just spread it into the West because the West is all that matters. That's Trotskyism. And it's not Bolshevism, right? It It is an attempt to preserve the Eurocentrism of Marx. It's an attempt to preserve the Western chauvinism of Marx, right? It's not as reformist as social democracy. It has many more revolutionary rhetoric and trappings, but ultimately, it never was it's never fully ready to jump into the Eastern camp. Trotsky was never ready to be an anti imperialist, right? That's why if you read Trotsky's biography of Stalin, right, he wrote a book called Stalin, right? The first page of the book says that Stalin was an Asiatic brute. It says that the reason Stalin was not a real Marxist was because of his race. It's because he was from Georgia, right? And that he's not Western enough. He's Asiatic. That's called racism. That is called racism. But Trotsky was a racist, right? Trotsky may have been born in Ukraine, but he was in awe of Europe. He was in awe of New York City and London and Vienna. And he hated the East. And he said that Mao and the Red Army were a bunch of bandits, right? And he hated the Russian peasantry. And that was Trotsky. Trotsky was Eurocentric. All right. All right. Why are Maupin and infrared banned on subreddits? Well, look. I'll just be real with you all. Okay. There are. I mean, look what's happening in the chat right now. Okay. Well, don't look at it, and hopefully it's gone by the time people are watching this on repeat because this stuff just goes away. Look, there are bots that follow me around the internet. Okay. It's not a secret that I've traveled to many countries. I work for a TV network, and there are certain forces that don't want people to hear what I have to say, etc. And I've noticed that if you post anything by me in a Reddit forum, no matter what it is, immediately there are posts below it with the same half truths that we've all heard many times before, the same distortions of reality. He sat next to Dugin, he met with Dugin, and Dugin is Dugin. He's a Russian traditional conservative intellectual who's anti-imperialist, and so I met with him. His views are his views, my views are my views. He's a traditionalist conservative. I'm a Marxist and a 21st century socialist. We have different views, but they declared Dugin to be a Nazi, which he is not. You can't be a patriotic Russian and be a Nazi. But they declared Dugin to be a Nazi, and I sat next to him. That means I'm a Nazi too. Well, Dugin's not a Nazi, and I'm definitely not a Nazi for sitting next to someone who's not a Nazi. And he has his views and I have mine. He is definitely right wing, not a Nazi. He's a traditionalist conservative, and I'm left wing. But we gave a it was a conference on the future of populism. I sat next to Dugin. So what, right? But they post that as an attack. There's some stuff that I've said they take out of context, and it's the same shit, and it's the same posts, right? And it's like a computer bot probably puts these out there, or there's somebody that gets an alert if anyone mentions me on a web forum to immediately go in there and shut it down. And look, that's what goes on, right? And that's why it happens, right? Is it's an effort to try and prevent you from hearing what I have to say. That's all it is. Oh, absolutely. I will speak on current Chinese socialism. And thank you for the super chat, Blue Collar Gamer. All right. And that's what goes on here. And they do it to any anti-imperialist. They do it to Max Blumenthal. They do it to Ben Norton. And that's why I expect it, right? Basically anyone who puts out an anti-imperialist viewpoint, any like anti-imperialist personality, anyone who's a socialist they can't control, that is, it's not putting out a pro-imperialist message. They get this harassment. And it's just a fact of life. And it's something we have to deal with. But look, all of you saw through it. So if you are on here listening to me, other people can see through it too, right? And the thing is, it's very shallow. And many times I've seen people post this stuff, and people write below it, I'm sorry, I listened to that guy. You're just wrong, right? If you listen to these lives for more than 2 minutes, I'm not a racist. I'm not a white supremacist. I'm not on here advocating fascism or violence. I'm not, right? I'm on here advocating plain old Marxist socialism. I'm advocating socialism. I'm a patriotic American. I'm a Christian. But yes, I am from the Marxist and socialist tradition. And so there you go. But that's why, right? And that that they want to shut down, and they just ban anyone who is at all sympathetic to me from these Reddit forums. So it's just something to be aware of. But we keep going. I'm not going to surrender, and there you go. It's funny. One of the attacks I see on me is that I'm a grifter, and that's I think that's hilarious because you know how you can spot a grifter. A grifter is somebody who will never tell you something you don't want to hear. If I was on here to make money, if I was just on here to make money, right? If this was a grift, meaning that I'm just on here trying to make money, I would say things a lot differently than I say them, right? I mean, look, I am on here every night that I'm on here is telling you all things you don't want to hear, right? There are all kinds of times, night after night, I'm on here telling you things you don't want to hear. I am the harshest critic of the American left. I'm the harshest, and if I was a grifter, I would just tell you what you want to hear and try to get more money out of you, right? And that's what a grifter does. A grifter, and look, I mean, look, and to be fair, I mean, grift is a reality on the left, right? I mean, look, I don't listen to Chapo Trap House, but I've had many people point out, how how much money goes into you know how much money they scrape out and what comes out of it? And does any organization come out of it? Does any, I mean, that's true. How many people watch Vosh? I mean, hundreds of that. Could you imagine I'm building the Center for Political Innovation, CPI, right? If there were hundreds of thousands of people watching these lives, we would be changing the course of American history. But hundreds of thousands of people watch Vosh and then they go back to playing video games. Why? Because Vosh is a grifter. He's just telling them what they want to hear. He's just cursing. He's entertaining. He's sitting there cussing. He's feeding their pessimism. Look, I mean, I could make a lot more money if I was just a grifter. I could just be on here and just grift and tell you all what you want to hear. But that's not what I'm about, right? I tell you things you don't want to hear. I'm trying to build a real educational think tank, the Center for Political Innovation, to actually change U.S. society. And that means that we're gonna not be as popular. That means we're gonna deal with this harassment that we're dealing with in the chat right now, and people trying to ruin our conversation. That's just a reality, right? That's just a reality. So, it's just something we're gonna deal with, but we can deal with it. We're tough here. We've been through this. I don't know how many times. We've been through this many times. We survive. We get stronger. We're building an in real life community. We're getting stuff done. So nothing to worry about. Nothing to worry about. All right. Libertarianism and the Southern strategy. Well, actually, the Southern strategy, right? So that's the Southern strategy was like soft coded racism, right? That's the idea, right? Is that that there got to be a time, about 1960s, 70s, when you couldn't be openly racist in U.S. politics. So they would use code words like forced busing, right? Forced busing, right? That meant school integration. That meant sending your kids to school with black people, right? But politicians couldn't get up there and say, I want to make it so your kids don't have to go to the same school as black people, because then everyone would be like, you're racist. So the racist politician gets up there and he says, I am against forced busing. And all the racists go, yeah. And all the other people are like, oh, I guess he's just against people being forced to get on buses, right? Oh, that makes, right? Or, classic Ronald Reagan would use the Southern strategy. He would talk about welfare mothers. Well, what is a welfare mother? A welfare mother is a woman with children who receives government assistance. The majority of women with children who receive government assistance are white. However, in the United States, when someone thinks welfare mother, they tend to think of a black woman. That was the Southern strategy. And the Southern strategy was used to push free market libertarian policies. But it only worked because of the racism. And actually, I would argue that, the Southern strategy was a big part of neoconservatism, the neocons. And basically they figured out that average Americans are not libertarians, right? If you said to average Americans, you just walked up to them, hey, should we take all the food benefits away from low income families? They would go, no. I haven't watched that debunking, but CGTN has done a lot of great stuff lately. They would go, no, right? Taking food from hungry children, no. Now, your average Ayn Rand fan would say, yes, absolutely, but most Americans would say, no, I'm not going to take food from hungry children, right? most Americans, you said to them, hey, should we, cut the wages or get rid of all the government employees? And they would think, well, what, the police and the firefighters in my neighborhood? No, we can't do that, right? But if you racialize it, right, you say, should we take food away from people who don't look like you, who you have this stereotype in your head about, who you think are blah, 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 blah. If you make it about the other group, right, people are more likely to support it. And that's just a reality, right? And so in the United States, the neoconservatives in the 70s and 80s realized that they could push free market neoliberal economic policies by using the Southern strategy, right? If it became about taking money away from the welfare mother, not taking food away from low income children, right? If it became, it wasn't about, getting equal access and children having every child having access to good schools, but it became about opposing forced busing, that racializing economic policies was a way that you could get white people, low income white people, who generally would have a more liberal economic attitude to support free market right wing policies. That's where they're connected. That neoliberalism, neoliberal economics was pushed, by neoconservative politicians utilizing racialism. That was the best way by making it about race, by making it racial. That was a way that you could push free market policies, and it worked. It worked, right? And still to this day, you meet low-income white people who really do believe that only black people get welfare. That's ridiculous, right? But I mean, it happens. There are a lot of low-income white people who believe things like that, right? Believe that only low-income white people, and for a long time, the issue of police brutality was like that, right? White people were convinced that that police brutality was only black people who ever suffered from police brutality, and they're black people, so they must be lying and they must be making it all up or something, But now things have changed in the country. I mean, there's video technology available, and there's also a lot of white people that are getting hit by the crackdown from the state. So that's changed the sentiments. But yeah, racializing an issue, you make it racial, and you appeal to white people's racism. You can get white people to support things they wouldn't normally support if they weren't thinking of it in a racial context. And it's weird because the woke left kind of does the opposite. It was like, by making welfare, subtly about black people, they were able to get, it was the right that was racializing things. Now it's the left that racializes it, right? It's actually kind of interesting that it's the woke left who makes everything racial, right? And they make it racial to point out inequality, to point out injustice, and it's not bad necessarily to do that, but it's interesting that it was liberals would just say low income families should get food stamps, and it was conservatives that were racializing it. So yeah, it's interesting. Alrighty. Texts by communists on socialism as extreme growth. Well, it's interesting. There was actually a guy who wrote a book on the very concept that I always talk about, and it was reviewed by the New York Times. It was called, what is it? Fully Automated Luxury Space Communism, right? And it was reviewed by the New York Times, explaining the very concept I talk about. But, I mean, if you want to read text by communist authors, Deng Xiaoping, right? Deng Xiaoping, the leader of China, explains extensively why socialism is based on vast material abundance in his writing. But there's also, I read to you from the book that makes that abundantly clear, The Critique of the Goethe Program by Karl Marx, where he explains, Marxist economics. Um, I mean, it's just something widely understood by those who are familiar with Marxian economics, that Marxism is based on growth and expansion of the productive forces. Um, China's welfare state. Well, it's different in different regions, from what I understand, in China, right? Some regions provide more benefits than others. But China's not a welfare state. I mean, it's a socialist planned economy, but, I mean, it's not a welfare state in the sense that Norway and Sweden are, right? China hasn't been, exploiting the world for for hundreds of years. They haven't built up the level of wealth that they're able to then provide some to all of their population. China is raising itself up out of poverty very rapidly. They've just eliminated extreme poverty in the country. I mean, they've given a lot of Tibetans and a lot of Uyghurs their first house with running water and their first house with electricity. They built new roads. I mean, they've done some amazing things, but they're rising up of they're rising out of poverty very, very rapidly. And I mean, just 30, 40 years ago, most of China was living in poverty. So yeah, they don't have the quality of life for everyone that Norway and Sweden have. Okay, that's just a reality. And China is not a welfare state. China is raising its people out of poverty with a centrally planned economy. It's a socialist society. It's the second largest economy in the world, but it's not on the living standard is not on the level of a European welfare state. Okay. Um, in some areas it might be, but not in other areas. All right. Reading reading habits and writing tools. Well, I read a lot. I read on the subway on the way to work. I usually, oh, thank you, Castor Allen. I read on the subway on the way to work. I usually bring with me different books. I often have to get my leather like bag. I have a leather like briefcase I carry with me, and I'm constantly filling it up with books, and I fill it up too much, and so I have to get it repaired. I actually need to get the zipper repaired on it now. I'm walking around without a very good zipper on my briefcase because I'm always stuffing it full of books. So yeah, I read everywhere when I can. I also will read in the bathtub sometimes. I will do that. And I enjoy reading. I also will go to diners and restaurants and order unnamed diet beverage and sit there and read. I've been doing that since I was in high school. When I was in high school, I started going to restaurants and reading books in restaurants, and I actually that was one thing I really missed during the total lockdown we had, where you couldn't go out. The ability to sit in a restaurant and read a book. It's just so satisfying to sit there with my unnamed diet beverage and read a book in the restaurant. It's a very satisfying feeling. So that's my reading habits. Writing tools. Well, I type. I mean, I don't write by hand. I mean, I have very sloppy handwriting. I type. That's how I do it. I type. Some people, they write everything by hand and then type it up later. I don't. I type, right? I type. And it's a process. You learn to do it. It's just like painting a picture, or I mean, you learn to do it. And you write and you rewrite, right? You write a first draft of it, and then you go over it and you make it better, and then you go over it and then you make it better. I've learned that if you're ever forcing yourself to write, if you're never not excited about what you're writing, it's crap, right? And I've noticed that whenever I'm like just churning stuff out to fill space, it's crap, right? You always have to be getting a thrill out of what you're writing. You always have to be invested somehow in your writing for it to be good. When you're just trying to, when it's like, when you're just, when it's like you're writing a report for school or something, you're just trying to fill space, forget it. You always have to be enjoying what you're writing, getting a thrill out of it. And sometimes it takes you a while to get the concepts to make you excited about it. You'll think, okay, I need to write a section about the French Revolution, but you have to find a way to get yourself excited about the French Revolution, and then you can write it. If you're just forcing yourself to do it, it doesn't come out good. Right? It doesn't come out good. Now, sometimes you have to write things that are not good, right? Especially, I mean, look, I mean, we all sometimes have to do things that, it's just you're just filling it, but that's not good quality. To make good quality writing, you have to make yourself excited about it, right? If you don't feel excited about it, there you go. All right. Okay. A lot of super chats to get through, but that's okay. Mein Kampf, that's the autobiography of Adolf Hitler, the founding document of the Nazi movement. It was written, I believe it was written. Was it written uh, while Hitler was in prison, or maybe after he was in prison? Yeah, it was after he was in prison. After he got out of prison for the beer hall putsch. I've read it. And it's interesting because you have to wonder how much of it is actually true and how much of it is just propaganda, right? But what's interesting is that, I mean, He's certainly not like an American right winger. I'll give you that, right? He was definitely right wing, and he calls himself right wing. All these people who think Nazis were left wing are idiots, and I don't know how people think the Nazis are left wing. Like throughout Mein Kampf, he's like, "I, as a leader of the right wing party, we must build a right wing." Hitler's right wing, right? But it's like, the right wing in the United States says, "Oh, every right wing equals good, so Hitler must have been left wing because everyone knows he's bad, right? National Socialist. Oh, he criticized capitalism. He must be." No, Hitler was clearly on the right. And then you get these, the bread tubers. They think Hitler was left wing also because everyone who disagrees with them is a Nazbol or a straw. I mean, it's like they somehow in their minds, it's like the idea that Hitler was a leftist, which he was definitely not. Hitler was a conservative. He was a right winger, if there ever was one. I mean, his whole movement was about trying to glorify the past. He was a right winger. But somehow this notion that Hitler was a leftist has been just absorbed by everyone, and it's wrong. Libertarians think it, conservatives think it, and bread tubers think it, right? I mean, they think somehow I'm out here talking about left wing ideas, and they think somehow I'm on the right. I mean, it's crazy. Hitler was not left wing, but if you read it, you know, he talks about, he didn't get along with his father. His father wanted him to be a government official. He wanted to be a painter. So he and his father fought, and he was kind of kicked out of his father's house or whatever. So, he ended up living in Vienna, the capital of Austria. He's living in Vienna. He doesn't get into art school. He's not accepted into the art school. He becomes kind of a house painter. He's like painting houses. He's a member of the Painters Union, and he meets communists in the Painters Union. And the communists, they think they impress everyone by making them smart by using big words, but they're actually very stupid, and they're manipulating Germans against each other, employers against employees, blah, blah, blah. He gets drafted to fight in World War One, and that's such an amazing experience. And he writes about World War One in these glowing terms, like it's Valhalla, and World War One is just so amazing. And he writes about World War One and this. And what that really is that's PTSD, right? Because we know Hitler lost his eyesight in World War One due to poison gas. And he saw many of his, there was a story that he was talking to somebody and he walked away, and then the four people he was talking to all got blown up and killed. And if he had not walked away in one moment, he would have been killed. So Hitler had horrendous PTSD from World War One. But when he writes about World War One, he writes about it in very glorious terms, which is something that people who have very chronic PTSD will do, right? Is that they will remember, they will remember things, they will split their memory. They have this like romantic, or tragic or something. They have this like glossy image of what happened to them that they consciously remember. But then when they dream at night, when they're in situations that trigger them, they remember what really happened. And this is very common with people who have PTSD. So Hitler, right? He remembered World War One. He remembered losing his eyesight. He remembered fearing for his life with bombs and getting shot at. He remembered what actually happened in World War One. But consciously in his mind, he just remembered this Valhalla and romantic, and he was fighting for the fatherland, and it was so amazing, And then you see that, and that comes across in the text that Hitler had, a split memory of World War One. So then, he loses his eyesight. He's in the hospital. He's in the hospital, and he discovers that all these other soldiers in the hospital with him have intentionally injured themselves to get out of fighting. They like shot themselves in the foot or whatever because they didn't want to fight in the war. And he's just so horrified that they would, be cowardly and not fight for their fatherland. And he blames it on the fact that they were influenced by communist Jews, and that's the quote stab in the back, right? That the Jewish communists, betrayed Germany in the war and undermined the war effort, blah blah blah. He gets out of the military. He's a homeless veteran, right? He's a homeless veteran basically. And first he joins the Christian socialist movement, but he thinks they're too weak because Christian socialism is for weaklings, and they're not, they're too, he hates Marxism, but he thinks maybe Christian socialism that is religious rather than Marxist might be good, but no, he hates Christian socialism. They're all a bunch of weak, pathetic Christians, so he hates that. And then he joins the pan-Germanist movement, which is an attempt to build one state for all German people. And he doesn't like them, and they're not good enough. So then he finds the German Workers' Party, which is this small group of people And he joins them, and that's Mein Kampf, right? And you read it, and it is the viewpoints of the Nazi Party. And Nazis and fascists are collectivists. That's the connection that makes it leftism, which is an awful take. Yeah, exactly, Chris. And um, least favorite book you've read. All right, writing it down. Least favorite book I've read. Right. You know, favorite book I've Yeah, so I mean that's Mein Kampf, and it's interesting to look at it from a case point of psychology. I mean, at one point in Mein Kampf, I remember it kind of stuck with me. Is he rants against German parents not spanking their children, and he talks about how in German society it used to be that if a child got in trouble at school, as soon as they got home, their parent put them over their knee and spanked them for getting in trouble. And then he talks about how now as Germany's falling apart as a civilization, now when kids get in trouble at school, the parents blame the teacher, and it's like I've heard that exact same rant from conservatives many times. They've made that rant, so I just thought that was amusing to see like it in Mein Kampf. Many times I heard that exact same rant from conservatives about used to be parents beat their kids, and now when the kid gets in trouble, they blame the teacher. When I got in trouble in school, my parents beat me as soon as I got home, blah, blah, blah. And that exact rant, that exact same rant is in Mein Kampf. That blew my mind to see that in Mein Kampf. What else about Mein Kampf? I don't know. I mean, the reason it's not like American right wingers is because he's a hippie, and that kind of comes across, right? He's this guy who is fighting with his father and wants to be a painter, and he's like a homeless guy who wants to be a painter, and you know I don't know. It's like, again, it's like in the United States, Hitler would be somebody that we would consider to be on the left in the sense, and not in terms of his political views, but in terms of his lifestyle, right? He would be a hippie kind of. He's this homeless guy who wants to be a painter and is joining. It's like, and that's one thing I've noticed about the alt right, not the mainstream right wing, but like the alt right. There is this like oddly hippie edge to them. They are kind of intellectuals. They think with a lot more depth about politics. And so anyway, enough about that. But yeah, you asked me my thoughts on Mein Kampf. Yeah, it's a hateful manifesto of anti-Semitism written by Hitler. But it psychologically, it's interesting. But you have to wonder, how much of it did he even write, right? How much of it was written by other people? It was an attempt to probably deal with people in Germany who felt the way he felt. There were probably many people in Germany who had that split PTSD and remembered World War I as glorious, right? There were probably many people in Germany who had fought with their fathers and gotten kicked out of their houses. There were probably many people in Germany who had been homeless veterans for a while, and so you have to wonder how much of it is even true, right? One thing he does not mention in the book, which is a pretty big important fact, is the reason that he joined the German Workers' Party, which he eventually took over and formed as the National Socialist German Workers' Party, the Nazi Party, was because he was a cop informant, right? He was being paid by the German police to infiltrate quote unquote radical groups. So the reason that he joined the party he eventually took over was because the police and the government were paying him. He was a spy. He doesn't mention that in the book. Now, that's a historical fact. It's confirmed by many, many people. He doesn't mention that. Well, that's a pretty key detail, isn't it? So you have to wonder if he's covering that key detail up. Oh, the reason I joined this group is because I was sent there to spy on them. Well, you have to wonder what else he's covering up. The whole thing could be a fabrication. The whole thing could be a fabrication for all we know. He could have sat down with a ghostwriter and answered about 10 questions, and then the ghostwriter came back to him with a whole thing written up to appeal to the psychology of an angry German military veteran. Um, you know, um, that very well could have been what happened, right? For all we know. The other thing is it was a lot easier to lie back then. Nowadays, with computers and stuff, people can track you down. They can find out where you came from. They can find out where you were. It's a lot harder to fabricate things about your own life, nowadays, right? People who write autobiographies, people fact check them all the time and shout, phony, phony. right? That happens all the time, right? People like, I mean, they read people's autobiographies and there's some little detail it's not right and it's phony. You're a phony. Phony. You're a phony. Right? So, but back in the 1920s, do you think, I mean, there was very little records. There was no Google. No one could pull out their phones. And so there you go. I mean, the whole thing could be a fabrication for all we know. But yeah, that was my impression reading the book. So there you go. All right. Which is worse, Hollywood or Mockingbird Media? I don't know. I mean, Hollywood, sometimes Hollywood can put out decent stuff, right? Occasionally you will see a Hollywood movie that seems to hint at some anti imperialism or anti capitalism. But the quote, and sometimes mainstream media will report on the right thing. I mean, both of them are bad and both of them are a negative influence. I'm not sure which one is negative, at the moment, So there you go. Socialism with Chinese characteristics, market socialism. Well, I think when Deng Xiaoping adopted, started using the term socialism with Chinese characteristics, what that was referring to was that he was breaking with the Soviet model of doing things, right? During the Cold War, you had an economic and political system that developed that people call it real socialism, really existing socialism, actually existing socialism. Stalinism is what it's generally called by people who don't like it, and it refers to a one-party state with a centrally planned economy, which is almost all state ownership, collective farms, state-run factories, a great leader at the leader of the center who goes around, encouraging people in the factories to work really hard and has material incentives to reward people for working hard. And that system, what Stalin figured out and developed during the 5-year plans, that system was basically, that was how Cuba's economy was. That's how all the Eastern Bloc economies were, and that was the system. That was what socialism was. And so when Deng Xiaoping said socialism with Chinese characteristics, he says, we're going to start doing socialism our own way. That's what he's saying. He said, well, we're going to break with really existing socialism. We're not going to follow the Soviet model anymore, is basically what he's saying. Now, what that meant, though, in practice, was adopting a market sector and having market socialism and foreign investment and free trade zones and model cities, etc. So, so socialism with Chinese characteristics in and of itself is not saying that. It's just saying we're going to do things our own way. We don't have to do it the same way the Soviets did. Market socialism is what that meant. But, that it's they're two separate concepts, but ultimately it was an explanation for doing the same thing. All right. And Deng Xiaoping, he was the one who always emphasized that socialism requires vast material abundance. All right. Best books by Lenin. Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, The State and Revolution, Left-wing communism and infantile disorder. What else? What is to be done? What else? What is to be done? Uh, yeah, State and Revolution, Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism. Um, yeah. Oh, The Right of Nations to Self-Determination. That's an important one. What else by Lenin? Yeah, I mean, all very important books. So there you go. Oh, Proletarian Revolution and the Renegade Kautsky, says Class Analysis. And that's a very good book as well. The polemic against those who said the Bolshevik Revolution wasn't democratic enough. Right, Reconstruction. The person who asked the question referred to various figures. Reconstruction was one of the most hopeful times in U.S. history, right? Where, there's land redistribution, where, the freed slaves were voting, black workers and white workers were standing together and getting the support of the Union Army against the big plantation owners. And the Ku Klux Klan, and eventually the betrayal of Reconstruction by the Democratic Party or by the Republican Party is very tragic, very, very tragic. Did I miss a super chat? Which super chat did I miss? There was a super chat that went by. Did I miss it? Did I miss it? Don't think I missed it. Okay. All right. I'm just looking. Okay. All right. Best books on, any socialist movies. Okay. All right. Socialist movies. All right. Socialist movies. All right. Next question. Best books on Marxist economics. Fundamentals of Marxism-Leninism is a very good book on Marxist economics. It's the Soviet official textbook of Marxist economics, the fundamentals of Marxism-Leninism. What else is there? There's wow. I mean, there's many books on Marxist economics. The Wage, Labor, and Capital by Harvey Braverman, or no, not Wage, Labor, and Capital. It's called Monopoly and what is it? I read this. It's a very good textbook of Marxist economics by Harvey Braverman. It's called Wage, Labor, and Monopoly Capital. Yes, Wage, Labor, and Monopoly Capital by Harvey Braverman. I would recommend that. A very good book. What else? Albert Szymanski was a Marxist scholar in the 1970s and 80s. And he wrote a number of very good Marxist economic textbooks. He wrote a book on imperialism. He wrote Is the Red Flag Still Flying? Explaining the definition of socialism and why the Soviet Union was socialist, arguing against the Maoist critique. Albert Szymanski, Harvey Braverman. Who else? There's a Trotskyite who is actually, he gave good analysis of Marxist economics. His name was Ernst Mandel. Um, yeah, I mean, there you go. I would give him a recommendation. And what the heck? I'll just be honest, okay? I mean, just because, you don't have to like everybody. I just recommended Ernst Mandel. Ernst Mandel, not a good guy, Trotskyite, but his books on economics are good. Fred Goldstein of the Workers' World Party, he wrote a pretty good book called Low Wage Capitalism. I learned a lot from that book. It's a decent book. I learned a lot from it. I think the guy who wrote it is, not my favorite human being. He's, I'm, trying to refrain from using curse words. He's a really unpleasant human being who was particularly nasty to me on a number of occasions, but he wrote a good book, right? It's a good book, right? I learned a lot from Low Wage Capitalism. It's a good book. So read Low Wage Capitalism by Fred Goldstein. I would also recommend, I mean, again, I don't agree with Sam Marcy's viewpoints on a lot of things, but his book, High Tech, Low Pay, which is about, the problem of overproduction and the labor movement in the 1980s, I would recommend High Tech, Low Pay by Sam Marcy, right? These are Marxist economic textbooks, and I would recommend them. Economics is what Marxism is about. Um, Economics is what Marxism is about. What super chat did I miss? What super chat did I miss? I don't think I missed a super chat. I wrote it down, but there you go. Um, there you go. All righty. All righty. Okay. Favorite debates. The best debate that I had, the most satisfying debate I had was the one with Stefan Molyneux, I would say. Because um, which super chat is it? I've been writing them down as I go. Slavery was replaced by economic slavery. I wrote it down. That's on the list. Come on now. That's on the list. That is definitely on the list. All right. So, slavery replaced by economic. Yeah, that's on the list. Yeah. Yeah. You know, but yeah, favorite debates I would say was the debate with Stefan Molyneux. I think it was very satisfying to to debate him because he's a libertarian, and all he could come back with was that's not real capitalism. And I had my research, I had the data in front of me. He had no response to any of the data. He wasn't expecting me to actually bring data on the fall of the Soviet Union. Go listen to my debate with Stefan Molyneux. Listen to it on my channel, because on my channel he had this mic that would cut me off, but on my channel you'll hear everything I say because it was recording from my phone. And it was very satisfying, very, very satisfying to debate Stefan Molyneux and just refute his libertarian garbage. It was very, very satisfying. All he had was this old school communism kills people thing. And I had actual economic data to back up what I was saying. And he had, well, that's not real capitalism. And there you go. But I've debated a lot of people. I debated Vosh. I debated, the debate with Destiny. That was pretty good. I debated Destiny, Stephen Bunnell. And that was pretty satisfying as well because he was trying to smear the entire history of communism. I brought facts with me, and I think it went very well. That was a very successful debate as well. The debate with Vosh, I mean, I don't know. I mean, Vosh is pretty unbelievably bad. But then again, I mean, he kind of exposed himself, but at the same time, his audience is so ignorant that they didn't notice. And honestly, I mean, I don't know. I mean, it was whatever. I mean, the debate with Vosh is just such a vile human being. And, I mean, it was just, he just sat there and just, oh, anyone who supports China is a Nazi, and it's like, that in and of itself is a ridiculous argument. But I mean, his teenage audience, a lot of them are just so dumb that they don't know. So there you go. Okay, the question was slavery replaced by economic slavery, right? And yes, it's here. This is the next on my list. It was after favorite debates. Calm down, folks. If I write down your super chat, it's there. So, was slavery replaced with economic slavery? Well, okay, so we have to talk about what slavery means, okay? Because there is an economic system called slavery, right? After hunter-gatherer civilization, the first economic system you get, which is ancient Greece, it's ancient Egypt, it's ancient Rome, is called slavery. And slavery is an economic system in which you have slave owners who own land and slaves. There are two classes: slave owners and slaves. And the slave owners own the land, and the slaves work the land, and that's slavery. And what we had in the U.S. South during the 1800s, that was slavery in the sense that people were being owned by other people, but it was capitalism because they were using the slaves to produce products, which they were then selling for a profit. Under classical slavery, that doesn't happen. The Romans, when they put the slaves to work in their plantations and all of that, they ate the products that the slaves produced. The economic system of slavery is you don't have the slaves producing in order to sell things to make a profit. You have the slaves producing so the master can live off of them, right? In ancient Egypt, you have the slave who like fans the pharaoh. You have the slave who builds the house. You have the slave who cooks the food. You have the slave who works the field, right? But the economic system of slavery, like in ancient Greece, like in Egypt, like in Rome, like in China, for thousands of years, that system, right, it's not production for profit. It's a system in which there are two castes: slave owner and slave. Right? Feudalism is different than slavery. Right? Under feudalism, the serf has their own little tract of land, and they pay their obligation to the landlord, but then they get to keep what's left over. Right? It's like they have the rent to pay. The peasant is different than a slave. A slave is literally owned by the landowner. A peasant or a serf rents from the landowner, right? Right, and that's the difference. And feudalism is much more efficient than slavery. But the slave economy is different than what we did in the U.S. South. What existed in the U.S. South was capitalism with slavery. It was capitalism with people owning other people, but they were producing for profit. The slaves of the U.S. South were being driven to pick cotton, pick tobacco, produce things, etc., for the most part, in order to make profits. So the slave owner would sell what the slaves produced for a profit. So it was technically capitalism with human chattel slavery. And that's different than the economic system of slavery, right? And that, human history, we've gone from hunter gatherer civilization to slavery to feudalism to capitalism. We eventually will replace capitalism with socialism, which happened in China and some other places, but eventually it'll happen all over the world. And then eventually socialism will give way to communism, right? And once there's communism, there won't be any more scarcity or any inequality, so there'll be no basis for the need for class divisions. But and so then the history of humans dividing themselves into classes ends, and that aspect of the human species has come to an end. That is the Marxist narrative of human history. So, was slavery replaced with economic slavery? In a sense, yes. Right? We talk about wage slaves, right? Instead of us being owned by landowners, we're now selling ourselves like a commodity to a capitalist. So in that sense, yes, but we have to be clear what the definition of slavery is. There are, there's slavery within capitalism, and that's where people are owned by other people but used to produce products for a profit. And then there's the economic system of slavery that existed in Greece and Rome and Egypt, etc. Okay, two different things there. It can get very confusing. All right. Hitler meeting with Palestinians. How can we refute the leftist supported Zionism? Well, Hitler. Well, first of all, there's many layers to this. So first of all right, let me take a drink of water because there's a lot to unpack here. But this is actually an important thing. I'm glad you asked about it. Okay. All right. So Hitler was the leader of Germany. After World War I, Germany had been stripped of its colonies, right? The British, the French, the Americans won World War I. German imperialism, Austrian imperialism, and Ottoman Turkish imperialism lost World War I. So they all lost their colonies. The British, they had the Treaty of Sykes-Picot. They divided up the Middle East, etc. Right? The British then set up the Balfour Declaration, the British Mandate of Palestine. There started being Jewish settlements in Palestine. The Palestinians didn't much care for the Jewish settlements that the British were putting in Palestine. The Jewish settlements were very sympathetic to the British. They were aligned with the British. A lot of the Arabs in Palestine did not like the British, felt the British were their colonizer, and didn't like the Jewish settlements being set up. So there were fights, there were riots and stuff between the Arabs and the Jewish settlers. That happened. And the British military was sent to Egypt, or it was sent to Palestine in 1936, I believe. 36, was it 36 or 38? You had the British military going to Palestine to back up the Jewish settlers against the Arabs when the Arabs were rising up against the Jewish settlers and fighting them. So when all of this was happening, so you have to remember, so Germany had been stripped of its colonies. The British were the country that had starved millions of people in India, killed millions of people in Africa, killed millions of people in the Caribbean. Was the main, look, we all know how bad Hitler was. Hitler did the Holocaust and started World War II and is responsible for hundreds of millions of deaths. Okay, but before Hitler did all of that, there was this thing called the British Empire. And the British Empire killed millions of people in India. The British Empire killed millions of people in Africa. The British Empire killed millions of people in China. The British Empire invented racial eugenics and pseudoscience. The British Empire said survival of the fittest and used Charles Darwin's writings to justify genocide and killing. The British Empire was a monstrous, monstrous thing. And there were many people all across the developing world who hated the British Empire. And the main force of resistance to the British Empire had been communism, right? As people in the colonized world were becoming communists. But not all people in South America or in Ireland or in Africa or in India were communists, right? Not all of them agreed with communism. Some were deeply religious. Some didn't, they were rich people, right? In South America, you had a lot of wealthy folks who were anti-British and anti-American, but also anti-communist, right? And you had a lot of, the same in India. You had, people in India that were for Indian independence from the British, didn't like communism either. So you had this layer of people that were just kind of anti-British, anti-colonial, but also anti-communist. They didn't like communism. Then you have to add to the fact that after 1935, after the Seventh World Congress, the strategy of the global communist movement became to build a popular front. And because Britain and France and the United States were not fascist countries, that the orientation that communists in countries colonized by Britain or colonized by France or colonized by the United States got was to align with their colonizer against fascism, right? That's why in Syria, the Ba'ath Party was formed, because a number of Syrians, led by Michel Aflaq, didn't want to align with the French colonizer against fascism. They said the French colonizer was their main enemy, not the fascists. So they formed a new party because the Communist Party of Syria was saying we got to focus on fighting fascism. Let's get along with the French colonizer. In India, the Communist Party of India said, okay, we got to get along with the British colonizer because our main enemy is fascism, right? British Empire also killed and enslaved millions of Scots and Irish, absolutely. And in Ireland, right? In Ireland, the Irish communists had been a big part of the Irish resistance, but then when Britain was not a fascist country, the the Irish communists said, okay, we need to focus on fighting fascism, right? And so we're gonna, not focus on fighting the British as much. So because there was already a layer of people in the colonized world that were anti-colonial, anti-imperialist, but not communist, and then you add to that the Popular Front strategy, where the communists were aligning with democratic capitalists against fascism. Because of that, you had a lot of anti colonial people in the developing world who sympathized with Hitler. And it wasn't just Palestinians, it was Irish. There were a lot of Irish people who liked Hitler, right? And I'm sorry if that's offensive to anybody, but it's true. There were a lot of IRA sympathizers, in Ireland who, because they were anti communist, but also were anti British, sympathized with Hitler. And there were people from Kenya. There were Africans in Kenya. There were Africans that were anti-British that went and met with Hitler, that were anti-British. That Kenya was a British colony. They didn't like the British. They were Africans. They went and met with Hitler. There were a lot of Hindu nationalists and people like that who met with Hitler. And people talk about Gandhi and the letter he wrote to Hitler and such. So there was a lot of confusion among colonized people about World War II, and that was because the British had killed so many people, right? And that, yes, Hitler killed was horrendous. He was the worst dictator. He was obviously, it was awful, and no one is defending Hitler for any moment here. But before Hitler was around, people didn't know what Hitler was going to do. They did know what the British had already done. And actually, Hitler's ideas, Nazism, is largely a British ideology, right? It was the British Empire that invented racial eugenics and pseudoscience. It was the British Empire that pushed survival of the fittest and might is right. It was the British Empire that pushed, I talk about the Atlanticist pathology. The ideology of Nazism is largely a British ideology. The Germans, before Hitler came in, the Germans had the biggest gay rights movement of any country in the world. It was probably Berlin was one of the only cities in the world where gay people could walk around and be gay and no one bothered them, right? I mean, you had gay bars and gay clubs, and you had whole institutes dedicated to, to sexual liberation and such. And, it was Karl Marx the Marxist movement was biggest in Germany. The world's biggest communist party outside the Soviet Union was in Germany. The Social Democratic Party, which Marx and Engels had started, had been in Germany. Germany was very, very progressive, and that's why it was necessary to put Hitler in power to crush the progressivism of Germany. Germany was a very progressive place before Hitler came in. Hitler was something the British and the Western forces backed and eventually took over Germany, and then, Hitler turned against the British. But we got to get out of our mind, that the British Empire was a monstrous, monstrous force in the world. All over the developing world, they killed literally millions of people. They would gun down whole villages in Africa. There would be a village in Africa, and the people would be there, and they would just gun them all down. And it's like we have no idea, that's the worst thing is that the British Empire promoted libertarianism, Adam Smith economics, killed millions of people, but that's been kind of we think about World War II, and we just forget about that, right? We forget about all the people killed by British free market libertarian economics. And, so anyway, across the developing world, it wasn't just Arabs, it wasn't just Palestinians, but it was all over the developing world. There were colonized people who hated the British so much and saw Hitler as a guy who's not a communist, but he's anti-British, so they thought he might be their guy. And that was wrong. They were wrong to think that, but that's what they believed. Um, Thank you. That's what they believed. Okay, and that's a fact. There's actually a book called Native Son, which is considered one of the most important African American novels. Native Son by Richard Wright, and it's a book about an African American man who's falsely accused. It's like there's a situation where a woman dies and he's like accused of having killed her, and it's a very sad book. But the main character in Richard Wright's Native Son is Bigger Thomas. It's a main character named Bigger Thomas. And Bigger Thomas, the main character in Richard Wright's novel Native Son, is a low-income African American man who's deeply poor. And in one of the scenes in the book is that he goes to the movies with his friend, and there's a newsreel at the movie about Hitler. And the character in this novel, Native Son, the Bigger Thomas, says to his friend, he sees Hitler on the newsreel, and he says to his friend, he says, "I wish that our people had someone like that." And he makes that comment. And that there were feelings like that in the black community, right? That Hitler, when he talked about fighting for my race, fighting for my nation, fighting for my people, there were a lot of black people who said in America who'd been oppressed and felt like America and the British were their enemy and they thought, we want someone to fight for our race, right? And there was a lot of confusion, and that's just the reality of that situation, right? I mean, and there were black nationalists, in the United States who sympathized with Hitler, right? There were black nationalists who had anti-Semitic feelings and felt like black people were oppressed and felt like the Americans and the British were the main oppressors of black people. There were black nationalists who sympathized with Hitler. So, World War II was a big war. It divided the whole world, and there were confused people in many parts of the world. So, the fact that Palestinians met with Hitler, not surprising, right? They were fighting the British. Now, what doesn't get discussed is that it wasn't just Palestinians who met with Hitler, but Zionists who collaborated with Hitler. And there were a number of Zionists who met with Hitler and tried to make arrangements where Hitler would deport all the Jews out of Europe to Palestine and such. So, yes, Hitler met with Palestinians. Hitler also met with Zionists, and there were a number of Zionists who thought Hitler was a good thing, because they said, "Hey, Hitler makes it clear that Jews don't belong in the same society as Gentiles." There are a lot of Zionists who said, the revisionist party, which was, Irgun was their armed wing, and you had Likud. They made some pretty blatantly pro-fascist and pro-Hitler statements in their newspaper, and they argued that basically that Hitler proved that Jews needed to have their own country, and that they considered themselves to be Jewish National Socialists, right? What Hitler was doing for the Germans, they were going to do for Jewish people, right? That was right-wing Zionists. Most Zionists didn't feel that way. The Labor Party, the Israeli Labor Party, didn't feel that way, but the hard right wing, the revisionist party, there was some pro-fascist sentiments, So it's complicated. Sorry for my impatience. Had my jab today. It's all right, Joanne. No need to apologize. Don't worry, everything's fine. But I got to get through these super chats because it's getting late. But anyway, I just explained how among a lot of colonized people there was confusion, and so there you go. All right, I answered that. All right, Lincoln and the greenbacks. Yes, during the Civil War, Lincoln introduced the greenbacks as an economic measure, to try and stabilize the economy to fight the war. There you go. Libertarians attacking corporate welfare more than the left. Yeah, and the reason for that is because the left the left at this point just doesn't want to talk about economics. That's all they want to talk about. The left, they want to talk about a culture war, right? Middle America needs to get woke, and that's what they're mad about. They don't care about economics. So, if you talk about economics, you're a fascist, right? If you think that there's a ruling class, that's, so yeah, there you go. Mao's New Democracy. Well, that was Mao redistributing land in the Chinese countryside, and that the immediate program of the Chinese Communist Party was, they said China wasn't rich enough to be socialist, right? It had to have a new democratic revolution first, right? And that they needed to empower domestic capitalists. They needed to redistribute land to the peasants, but they had to go through the phase of new democracy before they could reach the phase of socialism, right? That the Chinese Revolution was a two-stage revolution. First you had the new democratic revolution, and then after that you had the socialist revolution, right? That in a country that's not fully developed and fully capitalist, Mao argued you need to have a two-stage revolution, right? Stalin's concept was called the National Democratic Revolution. Mao's concept was the New Democratic Revolution, right? That Stalin argued that in impoverished countries that are not ready to have, that are not fully capitalist yet, you have a two-stage revolution, and And in China, the first stage was called New Democracy. The next stage was called Socialism. Alrighty. IWW, a bunch of wimps. I haven't talked to anyone from the IWW in a long time. I really, I don't know if I would call them that. The IWW has an amazing history. The IWW was an amazing group. William Z. Foster was part of the IWW, and but yeah, I don't know. Anarchism generally now is it something different than it was. The syndicalists, the anarcho-syndicalists, you go back to the 19 teens, 1920s. Syndicalism was a very different movement. There's a comic strip on the internet called "If Modern Communists Fought," or "If Modern Anarchists Fought in Spain," and that pretty much sums it up. Anarchism today is very different than what anarchism or anarcho-syndicalism was back then, and that the SJW politics, you could call it, has taken influence in all anarchist circles and all left circles. A lot of the communist groups are like that now. Um, you know, Mujahideen Khalq, they're a terrorist group. They were designated by the U.S. government as terrorists for many years, but now they kill Iranians. They're a crazy group of terrorists who think that Masoud Rajavi is the second coming of like Mohammed and Jesus and Lenin combined, and he's brought. It's a very dangerous group, but at this point they're working with Israel, and they're an anti-Iranian activist group. But they started out as a weird Islamo-Marxist cult. All right, and they're neocons, and they're they're anti-Iran, and they lobby the U.S. government against Iran. That's what the Mujahideen Khalq is. The China-Tibet stuff. Well, China, after the 1949 revolution, China negotiated, and Tibet, ultimately it wasn't until like 1953 that Tibet ultimately, had the Chinese Communist Party come to power, and land was redistributed. Then you had the Tibet Civil War, where the U.S. government was arming Tibetan separatists and airdropping them into Tibet and killing people, and there you go. All right, AOC, the police thing. Yeah, that's awful. Sending the police to someone's house because they made a video criticizing you. A threat is a threat. You can't threaten anybody on the internet. If you threaten somebody, there's going to be consequences. But if you just make a video critical of a politician, nothing wrong with that. And that's intimidation. And I don't know if AOC herself made that decision or whatever. That's not cool. You're allowed to criticize politicians on the internet. There you go. All right. Current Chinese socialism. China has a socialist system. The banks, factories, and industries are forced to work in the interest of public good, not profits. There's inequality, sure. There's a market sector, sure. But at the end of the day, the Chinese Communist Party controls the economy, not the chaos of the market. All right. Least favorite book I've ever read. I don't know. There's a lot of books I start to read them and they bore me. I don't read books the way other people do. There's some people who read a book and they've got to read every word of it, like it's a novel. But with me, I read nonfiction books. I read a chapter that I'm interested in. I read a chapter here. I read it there. I go to the index. I find the section on this. That if you really want to learn from books, you have to learn to force the book to serve you, right? And that by doing that, right, that the book exists to give you the information you need. You don't serve the book serves you. When you're reading nonfiction, you read the book to get the information that you want, and you have to learn to do that. And then a lot of people, they don't ever get into reading because they they think it's like a movie where you have to watch every second of it, right, or else you miss something. And yes, with a really good book, you do that. But if you're just trying to get information from a book, you don't have to do it that way. Boy, socialist movies. I don't know. There are a number of movies that I could recommend. In terms of movies that are made in socialist countries, there is the Eisenstein films, October, Battleship Potemkin. Then in China, there's a movie that I actually kind of enjoyed. It's from the Cultural Revolution in China. It's called Breaking with Old Ideas. You can watch it online. It's a film they made during the Cultural Revolution, about a guy who starts a medical school in the countryside. It's pretty good. I enjoyed the beginning of the Great Revival. which is about the founding of the Chinese Communist Party. I enjoyed watching that movie. I saw it in the theaters here in New York. It's a Chinese film. What else? I thought the movie Free State of Jones, the Free State of Jones, put forward kind of a Marxist analysis of the Civil War and how, white workers suffered because of slavery and how their destiny, their future was aligning with the black people. What else? What other movies are there that are Marxist? Um, They Live. John Carpenter has admitted that it was intended to be a Marxist film, and you watch They Live. It's full of Marxist imagery and Marxist references. I mean, he kind of was picking up the aesthetics. If you read the literature of the Revolutionary Communist Party or the Spartacist League in the 1980s when that movie came out, that's kind of the aesthetic the movie was going for. And John Carpenter, he made that movie, and he admitted it was an anti-capitalist film, and it's heavily, heavily influenced by Marxism. What else? What else? There's a movie called Reds, starring Warren Beatty. It's about the life of John Reed, the guy who wrote 10 Days That Shook the World, who was a founding member of the Communist Party USA. And the film is actually subtly anti communist, but it does portray the founding of the Communist Party and American communists in a kind of sympathetic light. So, but it's subtly anti-communist, and it's interesting. It's probably one of the only like Hollywood movies that really goes into depth about like the founding of the CP and 1920s intellectuals and stuff. It's worth watching. I would watch Reds by Warren Beatty. I mean, it is subtly anti-communist, but there you go. Yeah, Reds by Warren Beatty, I would recommend. Even though it's subtly anti-communist, I would still recommend it. Wow. I mean, what else? I mean, I don't know. You know, um, I don't know. I when I saw V for Vendetta when I was in high school, I thought that was a revolutionary film. Oh, Lily is recommending Mission to Moscow. That's a great movie. Mission to Moscow is definitely a great film. I would recommend Mission to Moscow. That's a World War II film about the Soviet Union. The North Star by Lillian Hellman. That's a very good movie as well. That was made during World War II. Uninformed people who don't know the difference between National Socialism and socialism. What do you tell them? Well, I mean, National Socialism is Nazism, right? And National Socialism, the way it was interpreted, by Hitler, was that you don't have to, no property relations change. The economy is still private. Krupp owns his factory. Tyson owns his factory. Hollimer Schacht is a private banker lending money at interest and making profits, right? Capitalism stays intact. You just have this big, powerful government that spends a lot of money on the military and builds roads and builds concentration camps for anybody who gets, who questions the government or looks like they don't agree with the leader. That's basically what Nazism is. It's a Bonapartist, right wing Bonapartist regime based on militarism and brute force repression to try and save capitalism from a crisis. There is no socialism in National Socialism. No property relations changed. Barely anything was nationalized. It was not a socialist society in any conceivable way. It was just a heavy government spending money on the military and locking up people who dissented. Hitler fixed Germany's economy by putting half the country in prison camps and the other half in military uniforms. And then they had to have a huge war called World War II because it didn't resolve the crisis. That was my opening rant. I ranted about Bonapartism and where it comes from and why it doesn't solve the crisis. Well, that's why the Nazi state had World War II, is because at the end of the day, Bonapartism doesn't resolve the crisis of capitalism. Favorite books on 20th century China? I recommend The China Wave, Rise of a Civilization State. That's a very good book. I recommend When China Rules the World by Martin Jakes. I recommend, there's actually a very good textbook called China's Socialist Economy that's published by the Beijing Foreign Language Press. It's from like 1980. It's very good. It's a history of China's economy. What else? What else do I recommend? I recommend Xi Jinping's actual writings. Um, yeah. There's and in terms of, you said 20th century China, there's a lot of interesting books about the Chinese Revolution. Jack Belden wrote a book called China Shakes the World. Edgar Snow was the journalist, the first journalist and the last journalist to ever interview Mao was Edgar Snow. And Edgar Snow wrote Red Star over China. He wrote The Long Revolution. He wrote The Other Side of the River. And all of those books, he does in-depth interviews with Mao and talks about what the Chinese Revolution was doing. Han Suyin wrote a two-part biography of Mao called The Morning Deluge and Wind in the Tower. And you get to know, Mao's political career, and where he came from and all of that. That I would recommend. What else? Anna Louise Strong. She went to China and she wrote a lot about, she interviewed Mao and she wrote, books about the Chinese Revolution. Agnes Smedley. Now, there's a woman named Agnes Smedley, and she was a feminist in the United States. She wrote Daughter of Earth, which was kind of an underground hit, a psychoanalytic Marxist feminist novel in the 1920s. It was a huge hit. Um, and she, after she wrote that book that was an underground hit, Agnes Smedley moved to China, and she became like was like embedded with the Red Army, and wrote a number of books about her experiences with the Red Army. Agnes Smedley. She wrote a lot of good stuff about China as well. Yeah, there is a number of good writings about China and the Chinese Revolution. There were a lot of Westerners who became like sympathizers with the Chinese Revolution. So there you go. Okay, folks. I am exhausted. You took it out of me tonight, but that's okay. That's why we do these lives, and there's nothing I like doing more than talking about communism. So glad to talk with you all. But it's late, and I need to sleep. So I'm going to end it here. A new upsurge in the struggle against U.S. imperialism is now emerging throughout the world. Ever since World War II, U.S. imperialism and its followers have been continuously launching wars of repression, of aggression. But the people of various countries have been continuously waging revolutionary wars to defeat their aggression. While the danger of a new world war still exists, and the people of all countries must get prepared, revolution is the main trend in the world today. And while the danger of a new world war still exists, and the people of all countries must get prepared, revolution is the main trend in the world today. And on that